What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a supercut of all of my class overview videos, which is to say a compilation of all the ones I have done previously, which I had started work on just a couple weeks ago from the time of this video. And as always, when I finish a series, I try to put all those together in one place for people to find and make it a little bit easier, such as with my story supercuts. But this introduction is here to tell you a few important things, mostly that the purpose of these videos was to explain generally what a class does, what it's good at, and some of its general class mechanics on top of its class fantasy or the role-playing aspects. And you'll likely hear me say this several times over if you watch this for any length of time, is a deep dive into the math or number crunching of any of it. And that's important to note because while many of these are from before the launch version of the game, and thus you might hear me mention something not being available in early access in regards to specific class mechanics that weren't present until the full launch version. And ultimately, in the launch version, the monk class was the only one that saw I would consider major revisions, and the monk class is the one I did after launch, so those are already accounted for here. So basically what I wanted to tell you here at the beginning is that while the exact wording in places might be weird due to the exact timeline, these videos still very much so serve their purpose, which is to explain the class fantasy and general mechanics of them. So with that in mind, I hope you find the rest of the video and whatever class you are looking for to be helpful, and if you have any questions, by all means drop them down in the comment section below, and I'm sure myself or someone else will answer them. And with no further ado, the rest of the video. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a class overview for Baldur's Gate 3, and specifically the Barbarian. I'm going over all the classes ahead of the launch, and I've covered a couple of the casting classes already, but I wanted to switch things up and talk about a more martially focused character, and in that regard, it doesn't get much more direct than the Barbarian. With that in mind, though, we're not going to be crunching numbers or anything like that. We're going to be talking more about the general mechanics of the class as well as the class fantasy. Though, while many of these videos would serve as a nice guide, if you will, to 5th edition D&D in general, as that is what the game is based on, Barbarian in particular does have a few significant changes to the actual source material here. So most of this will translate, but some of it absolutely will not. To kick this video off, though, I like to start with the class fantasy, some of the reasons you might choose to be a barbarian. And while I'm sure many people have an idea of what a barbarian is in their head, and you can absolutely play it that way, it is a little bit more interesting than face value might have you believe, because barbarians utilize their rage and sort of primal instincts to guide and shape their martial prowess. So whereas a fighter trains and becomes an exemplar in knowledge and understanding of their specific style of fighting, and a paladin mixes both martial prowess with the benefits of worshipping and serving a god, a barbarian is much more about primal instinct and fury, which is reflected in their rage class mechanic. With that in mind, however, while we might label a society or something as barbarians, in D&D, true barbarians capable of harnessing that rage in combat are relatively rare, and it is in learning to harness that rage and manifest it that a barbarian can become truly powerful, which is kind of what makes them the kings of melee combat, really. You want to hit things in melee, and you want to do it really, really effectively. That's why you would pick a barbarian. And while that's all well and good, let's talk a bit about how that actually translates into game mechanics. First off, though, we're going to talk a little bit about some general information. This is a class whose primary ability is Strength, with a secondary, right behind it, being Constitution. As Strength is what we want to hit things, and then Constitution is what's going to help us stay alive. So naturally, those two abilities are what we have saving throw proficiency in, which makes us better at them. And then in terms of equipment, a barbarian will start with proficiency in light and medium armor, as well as simple and martial weapons, on top of the ability to use shields, which puts most things besides heavy armor and some other very specific weapons well within reach. And this is because, of course, the class focuses almost entirely on melee combat. There's not a ton of ranged options here. Next up, however, I want to talk about the primary mechanic of a barbarian, and that is their rage. During combat, and a number of times per long rest, depending on their level, a barbarian is capable of entering their rage state, which is going to do a few different things. For starters, they're going to get advantage on strength rolls, which means it's going to be easier to hit enemies and they will deal more damage as well, with the rage itself adding a small bonus to the damage, +2 most of the time, and then a little later it will jump up to +3, which is where it will max out for our level cap of 12. Moreover, however, this also works a little bit defensively because you become resistant to physical damage. That is to say, slashing, bludgeoning, and piercing. However, it does come with some limitations. Each rage will last 1 minute, assuming you get to use it to its full effect. However, you can't cast any spells during this. Your rage makes you incapable of holding concentration or casting a spell. However, the rage will also end early if you are knocked unconscious or you don't attack anything or take any damage for a turn, which means in order to keep your rage state up, you need to be actively attacking anything, or in the absence of being able to hit anything in a turn, you need to take some damage. Now, with our level cap of 12 in Baldur's Gate 3, you will potentially be able to go into a rage state up to 5 times per day, which should be more than enough. Now, while that is the primary mechanic of a Barbarian, there are, as you level up, several others which are going to help you out a great deal. Right out of the gate, we pick up Unarmored Defense. While not wearing armor, our AC increases by our Dexterity and Constitution modifier combined. This is going to give you a pretty high natural AC, which will make you harder to hit than most other classes, even when you're not wearing armor. Though, depending on the circumstances, there are plenty of times where wearing something like medium armor is actually going to be still more beneficial than the combination of these two modifiers. So depending on how much strength and constitution you have, sometimes it will be more beneficial to wear armor and other times it might not be. Thankfully, with this being based on a video game, all you've got to do is check in the inventory screen if something is going to give you more AC or not, as the game will do the math for you. Then at level 2, showcasing the Barbarian's reckless attitude, they pick up Reckless Attack. This is going to allow you to take advantage on your strength-based melee attacks, with the downside being that enemies will also get advantage against you, which means that it will be easier to hit enemies, and it will be easier for them to hit you as well, which is especially helpful as a Barbarian. Because if you remember, while we are in our rage state, we're going to be resistant to physical damage anyway, plus a Barbarian just has a really high natural health pool. So while Reckless Attack might sound like something you want to use sparingly, you can actually use it quite a bit while still taking minimal damage because of how your class works. Also at level 2, a Barbarian will pick up Danger Sense, which makes them better at making dexterity saves when they are attacked by something like, say, a fireball. You can make a save to take reduced damage from that, and it is easier for Barbarians to make that save. However, this does require them to be conscious. So if they're knocked out or something, you won't get this benefit. Then at 5th level, like pretty much all martial classes, they get their extra attack, which will let them make 2 melee attacks per round, if you will. However, they also get an extra 10 feet of move space while wearing no armor. So if you're not wearing armor, you get to move farther, which may or may not matter to you. At 7th level, they then pick up Feral Instinct, which gives them advantage on initiative. This means that in combat, they are more likely to be able to move more quickly. It will be their turn faster, in other words. Another thing this does is if you are surprised by an enemy, that is to say ambushed or something, if you enter rage immediately, it will actually let you skip the surprise round, which would normally cost you a turn where you wouldn't get to go right away. So Feral Instinct can be very helpful in getting moving in terms of combat much more quickly. And then at 9th level, Barbarians will pick up Brutal Crit, which allows them to deal extra crit damage, basically just adding extra dice to the damage itself. And then at level 11, we pick up Relentless Rage, which will allow you to, instead of dying when you're brought to 0 health while raging, if you make a Constitution save, you can be brought to 1 HP and continue to fight instead, basically making you harder to put down. And that will constitute most of the base class features to expect as a Barbarian within the level cap of Baldur's Gate 3. And as you can probably tell by all that, a lot of it is about being very proficient in melee combat, both in terms of damage done and your own survivability. These class features will very simply make it very advantageous for you to hit things in melee, while also reducing the inevitable damage you're going to be taking. And all of that is before we even start talking about the Barbarian subclasses. This is where what was homebrewed by Larian is pretty substantial. Both of the subclasses available in the early access have been homebrewed a good bit. One of them I think was a common sense thing, and then the other one is a near overhaul, with the third one not being being in early access, but we know a little bit about it, so we'll talk about this one, but obviously not the specifics, as what, if anything, they choose to change there could be substantial. First up, though, in terms of subclasses, we have the Berserker. This is the straightforward option. This changes your rage into Frenzy. While using your Frenzy version of rage, you get to make an extra attack or throw something as a bonus action. This means that in addition to potentially making 2 attacks at level 5, you can make another melee attack simply as a bonus action, which by itself is very good. And in the tabletop version, they balance that a little bit by causing your character to become exhausted after a frenzy. However, that's not the case in Baldur's Gate 3. The frenzy does not exhaust you. And while that is absolutely a pretty big buff, this is ultimately because there's no real limit on resting in Baldur's Gate 3 outside of some supply type stuff. So even if you got exhausted, you could clear the status effect to a point where it's more of a nuisance than something actually hindering you, which is why they chose to get rid of it. The second subclass in the early access period that we're already familiar with is the Wildheart subclass. This is a reimagining of the Totem Warrior subclass that puts you more in tune with your animalistic fury. This is going to allow you to take on the heart, if you will, of one of a few different types of animals, though as a base, anyone with the Wildheart feature will be able to speak with animals, which is certainly nice and will come up a fair bit. From there, however, depending on the heart you choose, it will make a change with your rage. It will modify it a little bit, giving you an extra effect and potentially an extra ability to use while you are raging. The elk will give you a charge ability and just various things like that. So if you're looking for a bit of versatility to your rage, Wildheart might be the way to go. But that brings us to our third subclass that has not made an appearance in early access so far, which is the Wild Magic subclass, which is very similar to the wild magic of a sorcerer, but in barbarian form. Wild magic barbarians are able to sense out magic by being able to detect concentrated forms of it, which is a nice sort of just benefit they get by being a wild magic barbarian. But the other half of this is Wild Surge. When a barbarian enters a rage, they experience a wild surge that will then convey an effect that lasts while they are raging. Exactly how this is implemented are things we don't know yet, but in the tabletop version, this can be something like randomly teleporting you up to 30 feet, an enemy taking damage and then giving you temporary hit points, alongside a variety of other things that could happen. This adds some unpredictability to your rage. And while the other two subclasses are pretty straightforward, the roleplay of this one centers around the idea that barbarians, by their nature of being in tune with their own ferocity and animal instincts, are people that can be pretty susceptible to the influences of rampant magic and intense emotions. With all of that said, though, let's talk a little bit about playing a barbarian. Naturally, as you might imagine, this involves a lot of melee-oriented combat. They don't really do ranged, at least as a pure class, and then they also don't really try to cast spells outside of just hitting things very, very hard, while at the same time being potentially very hard to kill. So because of that, they can often play the role of a tank quite well, as especially in the form of a video game, which is going to be handling all of the math along all of these class mechanics we'll be utilizing, which is going to make them a pretty straightforward class to play, as much of the gameplay is simply going to be activate rage and hit things. However, they do have one pretty big weakness, which is they have to actually get into melee range to engage you in melee, which goes for enemies as well. So if you can't reach something with a barbarian, that can pose you a lot of problems. So much of the gameplay here revolves around making sure you are in melee range and just destroying things otherwise. Despite how straightforward the barbarian class is, there are a variety of pretty interesting multi-class options you can take, with a couple of them being pretty popular, and usually being mixes of other martial classes. For instance, mixing just a barbarian and a fighter can give a barbarian access to the action surge ability of a fighter, which is going to give them even more attacks. And if you're already using a berserker barbarian, this can be an extreme number of hits. And given that the 11th and 12th levels for a Barbarian are not that interesting, using those to get the 2 levels in Fighter you would need for Action Surge could be incredibly effective. But another option is to mix a Barbarian with a Paladin, because Paladins with just a couple of levels as well get access to Divine Smite, which lets them deal extra damage on a melee hit, which is already a Barbarian's whole deal. If you wanted to take it a little bit farther, you could actually get things like Aura of Protection and everything as well, but it's not strictly necessary. Another fun option is to mix Barbarian with Druid, which will give you access to Wild Shape, and you can activate Rage while also being wild shaped into an animal, which is going to give you extra health as well, making you an incredibly difficult to kill tank. Now, the main thing to keep in mind though when you're multi-classing a Barbarian is that they cannot cast spells while raging, and while things like Divine Smite work because they are not technically a spell, this makes other casting classes pretty much a no-go. This is not a class you would really want to build a Gish character with because it's not really designed for that. Barbarians are designed to be in melee, hitting things as hard as they can, and multi-classes that facilitate that can certainly work out. You can even mix it with Rogue if you want to get crazy, but while it's certainly a little bit reductive, ultimately Barbarians are really good at hitting things, and they don't have to worry too much about the details beyond that, outside of 1 or 2 important class mechanics, with the rest mostly just being passive. But what I find especially interesting about Barbarians is while they are often portrayed as the hulking brute who lacks the brains, the actual class fantasy of them, and them simply drawing their power from being in tune with their rage and their primal instincts, can lead to a lot more interesting use cases than simply their more brutish portrayal. However, it can also certainly be that, and I think all of that combines to make a class that is pretty fun without trying to overreach too much. That though is going to do it for this video. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you learned something about Barbarians and D&D. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know what you think about Barbarians down below, of course. How do you like to play them, ideas for other people, anything you'd like to add, the usual stuff. Regardless of any of that though, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on everybody, Mortem here, this time bringing you my video on the Bard class in Baldur's Gate 3 ahead of its launch, where I have been covering all the classes relatively in depth, but less so in terms of number crunching and more about their class fantasy as well as their general game mechanics. And with that in mind, when it comes to Bards, a surprising amount of that was transferred directly into the game, so this one could roughly serve as a guide to playing 5th edition D&D as well, as that is the system we are using here, but do know I'm not covering a ton of things like the specific math, and we'll save that for things like build videos. But broadly speaking, before we dive into this, Bards as a class are very versatile. They're able to do a ton of things proficiently, even if they aren't quite the best at it. And that is in addition to being able to support your party at the same time. And because of that, Bards can fill a variety of roles. So with that in mind, let's actually talk about what the class fantasy of a Bard can be. So first up, an important distinction about what a bard is. Throughout the Forgotten Realms, our world setting, you can find all sorts of performers. Almost none of them are what is considered a bard. A bard is an individual through either natural talent or a bargain of some sort potentially, which may or may not be exaggerated in great detail, is nonetheless capable of bringing out the magic in both music and vocals. Things like turning a simple song into a magical effect that makes people more pliable in social situations, or turning simple words into real damage caused to someone, causing words to in fact hurt you. So when you talk about a bard in D&D, it's not enough to simply say a performer, because there are many performers. Bards are people who very specifically weave magic into their music and voice. And that in and of itself requires both a natural talent to do so, on top of the ability to learn and find hidden knowledge where it might be otherwise concealed from most everyone else. Specifically in music most of the time, which means that as a spell focus, bards typically use their own own instrument, and they are in fact full spellcasters. If we were to take them all the way to level 20, they would get 9th level spells. However, with the level cap in Baldur's Gate 3 only being 12, we will ultimately get 6th level spells. Now, the nice thing about the class fantasy of a bard is that much like the class itself, it's incredibly versatile. Beyond what I just told you, the rest is really up to you, down to the instrument you use, the way you choose to convey your music, and how you present your character to the world can all come into play. For instance, while a lot of people might think of a more theatrical performer when it comes to bards, because of their many skills, it's very much so possible for a bard to be more of a warrior who uses war chants as the basis of both their music and thus their magic. And while I am well aware many people really love to play this class in a way that's, let's say, very romantic in nature, especially with their high charisma stat, there's a lot more you can do with this thematically. And thanks to the many skills that are available to them, as well as the many avenues of approach they have to things, while they might not be as good at a specific thing as another class, they are quite good at almost everything. So with that out of the way, let's talk about some general information to know about bards in terms of proficiencies and stats. So ability score wise, you want to have really high charisma, as that is both our casting stat as well as the basis for many of our other abilities. And then the next highest would typically be dexterity. This is not a hard requirement, and there are a few ways to build a bard that focuses more on strength, but in most cases, dexterity is usually the way to go. At a base level, bards are proficient with light armor, simple weapons, a hand crossbow, long swords, rapiers, and short swords. However, thanks to some of their subclasses and things, they can get access to other proficiencies pretty easily, but that is what is available to the base class. Now from there, let's talk a little bit about their spellcasting. They don't have to prepare their spells, they can simply use the ones that they know, provided of course they have available spell slots to do so. However, probably the main thing to know here is that while it is very much so possible to be an offensive spellcaster with a bard, many of their spells are more like illusions and enchantments and general support and utility. They do have a few offensive options, but not nearly as much as say a wizard or a sorcerer. Much of their magic, as you might imagine, is typically based towards sound-oriented spells, things that affect language, your ability to talk to certain things, spells that are just generally very loud, like Thunderwave. So while I would say they make, for the most part, better support casters than a primary spellcaster or damage spellcasting, they can absolutely be offensive with their spells. In fact, they are best known for something like Vicious Mockery, one of their cantrips, which uses the magic of their insults to both damage an enemy and also give them disadvantage on their attack rolls. But as they are full spellcasters, you can absolutely make very good use of the many spells available to them. Just don't expect to be hurling fireballs or shooting lightning from your fingertips in most cases. Next up, I want to talk about one of the big bard abilities, which is Bardic Inspiration. As a bonus action, so in addition to whatever else they do that turn, it's possible for a bard to use their music to inspire someone. This will give them a extra 1d6 on their next attack roll, ability check, saving throw, whatever. You throw a d6 and you add that as a bonus. Though in order to use this on someone, they do have to be within range, which is about 60 feet, and then they also need to be able to hear you. You'll be able to do this a few times per day based on your charisma modifier, and then it's reset when you take a long rest. As you level up, this becomes more effective. At 5th level, it turns into a d8. At 10th, it turns into a d10. And for BG3, that's all you need to know, as our level cap is 12. But remember, this is a bonus action, so typically a bard will be able to do something else and then also inspire someone on their own turn. This inspiration ability is a huge part of what bards are all about, and it naturally comes up a good bit here and there in other places as well for their subclasses, so we'll wind up talking about this a bit more once we get to that point. But always remember, a couple of times per day at least, a bard will be able to give someone a potentially very sizable bonus to something they are doing. From there, let's talk about the rest of their class mechanics. First up, we have Jack of all trades. So this will affect the skills that your character is not proficient in, basically giving you half of the bonus you get on the skills you are proficient in. Bards, much more so than other characters, get a lot of skills with which they can gain proficiency, which is one of the reasons they make a great face character, or that is to say the one doing all the talking. For the person that will be rolling these checks, bards have huge bonuses bonuses to many of them, and Jack of all trades ensures that they always have a bonus to something, because any skill that they are not proficient in, they will get half of their proficiency bonus rounded down as a bonus anyways. And the next level, level 3, actually takes this a step farther, with expertise. Expertise will allow you to choose 2 of your skill proficiencies, and your proficiency for that is doubled, basically showing that you are really, really good at that thing. And then at 10th level, you'll be able to choose another 2 skills to do this with, which makes bards very, very good at passing all sorts of ability checks. However, also at 2nd level, we get Song of Rest, which is a little bit changed from the tabletop version. In Baldur's Gate 3, this effectively just gives you another short rest for the day, but in the tabletop version, this allowed you to restore more health during a short rest, so it works a little bit differently. Now at level 5, we will be gaining Font of Inspiration. This will allow us to restore our bardic inspiration whenever we short rest in addition to a long rest, which basically means we get to give people that large buff even more often, which is pretty helpful. And then at 6th level, they pick up Counter Charm. As an action, we can start a performance that allows us and friendly creatures within 30 feet to get advantage on saving throws against being frightened or charmed, which basically means it's much more difficult to frighten or potentially charm all of the characters in our immediate vicinity, though it will cost you an action to do this. That is compared to a Paladin who can get something similar for no action basically, but still in certain situations very useful. Though this does require those creatures to be able to hear you, and if you get silenced or incapacitated, this stops working. Then at 10th level, we pick up Magical Secrets. Bards are able to learn about magic from a wide spectrum of what magic is. This enables them to choose 2 spells from any class, including your own, a bard, and they are added to your spells known. In the tabletop version, you would get a few more of these, but again, with our level cap of 12, we're only going to get this if we take Bard all the way to level 10. Pretty much the only requirement here is that it must be of a level you can cast, which means, again, in the name of versatility, Bards are very, very good at a little bit of everything. Now from there, we'll wrap this up a bit by talking about subclasses. Subclasses for a Bard are their colleges. You see, Bards, by their very nature, are a very socially oriented type, and in order to preserve the traditions that they've studied and discovered, they form what they call colleges, which are sort of loose organizations of bards. Joining one of these colleges will give you access to some unique features which help you dive even further into some forbidden or potentially just hidden knowledge. In Baldur's Gate 3, we will ultimately have access to 3 of these, one of which is not in early access, but 2 of them are Lore and Valor, and then the third one is Swords. The College of Lore is all about leaning into that versatility. You will gain proficiencies in even more skills on top of the ability called Cutting Words. This will allow you to also use your bardic inspiration to apply a debuff to enemies, basically shaking their confidence where you would rather inspire your friends. So at the cost of bardic inspiration uses, you can debuff enemies instead of just buffing allies. This will also give you access to a couple more magical secrets once you hit level 6, which makes College of Lore a pretty decent way to go if you want to purely be a support character. However, we have 2 more options, both Valor and Swords. It is an odd inclusion to have both of them, because generally speaking, Swords is just considered superior to College of Valor because both of them are more martially focused colleges. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some home rule tweaking here once we actually see College of Swords, or maybe just even to College of Valor on the actual launch version. But both of these are going to give you armor proficiencies, martial weapons, an extra attack at level 6, but the difference is College of Swords gives you access to an ability called Blade Flourish and a fighting style, which has to be either dueling or 2-weapon fighting, which is to say dual wielding. So you're going to get a bonus to just one of those 2 types of fighting by being a College of Swords bard, but Blade Flourish will allow you to make a specific type of flourish, either defensive, slashing, or mobile, all of which will give you extra damage to the attack itself, but then a secondary benefit such as extra AC, hitting more than one creature within 5 feet of you, or allow you to use your reaction to move a little bit farther afterwards. So because of those things, College of Swords is generally the better way to go. Really the only way you wouldn't want to take College of Swords is if you didn't want to use a scimitar specifically, as that is required here, but it will allow you to use any weapon you're proficient in as your spell focus. Whereas the College of Valor will literally get all of your martial weapon proficiencies. So College of Valor allows you to focus on more weapons in general, which could potentially be the benefit there, with the other big change being that Valor gets access to combat inspiration, which allows them to buff others as well as themselves, specifically the weapon damage rolls. Though as an alternative, it can also add that bardic inspiration to that character's AC as well. So Valor is a little more open and allows you to buff others in some of the ways that College of Swords will allow you to buff you, but if you're making a martially focused bard, College of Swords in this case will usually be your best option, outside of just maybe really wanting to use a greatsword or something. All that to say, your subclasses are basically the option of more skills and spells, or two options more suited to martially focused characters. That said, let's actually talk about playing a bard. As I mentioned a few times here, bards are really great at versatility. There is very little roles that they can't fill in some capacity, so whatever you might need in a moment, there's a chance a bard might be able to do it for you. As they are full spellcasters, they have the potential to do quite well in melee combat. Depending on their subclass, they can pass a surprising number of ability checks thanks to all their proficiencies, and thanks to their naturally high charisma and all their proficiencies, they make an incredibly great face character, or the one doing all the talking. And thanks to things like bardic inspiration and simply their spell list, they also make a great support character or a support spellcaster in combat, so they can fill a wide variety of roles. They're usually not the best at any individual one of those roles, but they can do many of them. Also, I would be remiss if this video didn't include a note on performance. Baldur's Gate 3 is going to allow bards to make a performance check, or at least be much better at it, with any of their instruments, and seeing as how they start out with one, it's very easy to start a performance with a bard, which can attract people around a small area. And this is actually a way to provide a convenient distraction if you're trying to, say, sneak someone else into a building. So being able to use that performance in public areas with a bard in-game is absolutely going to be a pretty big boon to someone who might be looking for a creative solution to an interesting problem, which ultimately means that bards can do a lot for you. And how much you get out of them, and especially playing them, is largely down to you and what you intend to use them for. And that, combined with the wealth of role-playing that's going to be available both in this game and 5e as a system, I think bards have a potential to be a great addition to any party, as social situations is what they do best. That said, I like to talk about a few multi-class options at this point in the video, so let's go over that a little bit. A very common one is actually to take a couple levels of Paladin, and especially in Baldur's Gate where the level cap is 12, and bards in particular don't really get much past level 10, it makes a lot of sense to start as a Paladin, take 2 levels of that to get access to their things like Divine Smite and their heavy armor proficiency, and then go the rest into Bard. Because at this point, at the cost of a couple of spells, you're giving yourself access to way more damage via Divine Smite and everything, and protection from heavy armor, especially if you want to build that martially focused Bard who can pass all those charisma checks and everything. And another common one is of course Warlock, as the charisma requirements of both tend to synergize, and a couple of Warlock levels will give you access to all sorts of stuff like their unique Warlock spell slots, even more spells, Eldritch Blast, the invocations to go with it, and it can be a fun way to play a bard in a way that focuses more on the spell casting while still offering something a little unique. And to leave you with a third option that's kind of fun here is actually to mix bard with a rogue. Rogues tend to focus on dexterity, and typically most bards will as well, and going with just a couple levels of rogue can get you access to more expertise, sneak attack, as well as cunning action, can also be a pretty fun way to play. So bards do have a lot of options in that regard. You could even take a couple levels in Sorcerer to grab meta magic, a fighter for their action surge ability. There's a lot of options. But that said, I'd stray away from multi-classing them with things like wizards or druids, as most of what you would go into those classes for, you could just easily grab with magical secrets anyway. And with their differences in ability scores, there's just not a lot of useful things each class would give each other. But nonetheless, there's a a few ways to add some versatility to an already very versatile class. And that, combined with a very strong class fantasy, can make bards a lot more interesting than they might initially appear if you really want to dig into what they can do. But that is going to do it for today's video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an overview for the Cleric class in Baldur's Gate 3. Clerics are agents of the divine. They serve the gods very directly, who are in turn the source of their power. The setting of Baldur's Gate 3, the Forgotten Realms specifically, is host to a diverse world of gods and the spheres of influence that they control. As such, the people that serve those gods are equally diverse, which can make clerics in particular a very versatile class in how they approach various things in their pursuit of spreading the will of their deity. As such, we'll be going over general class mechanics, talking about the class fantasy of a cleric, but that said, we're not diving too deep into the math, especially since 4 of the 7 domains that we will ultimately be able to choose from as a subclass aren't available in early access ahead of launch. Though with 7 subclasses available, they will have the second most of any class 4 subclasses. From there though, let's jump right into it and talk about the class fantasy of a cleric. Clerics in D&D are more than just priests or people in service to churches of various deities. They are people who very specifically receive power directly from a god. They then use this power to essentially do whatever that god tells them to do, and because of this can be a very passive thing where a cleric's goal might simply be spreading that god's faith through their actions and deeds. Other times it might be a very much so direct communication where a god is very specifically telling a cleric to do something in particular. And that direct connection is largely what sets a cleric apart from regular priests or general religious figures. Many people worship the gods, but clerics have a direct communion with them. So in 5th edition D&D, where we have paladins and druids who have largely had their connections to deities made more ambiguous, they can be as involved or as irrelevant as you want in those cases, as opposed to previous editions where they were very much so connected to deities more directly. In 5th edition here, the only class that really directly serves gods is a cleric. However, because of all of those various things I just mentioned, how you choose to roleplay that is largely up to you, and it is pretty wide open. Though the first part of creating any cleric is deciding what deity you serve and what your relationship with that deity is. For instance, did you seek power out, or did that deity directly intervene and say, you are going to have this power because I need you to do things for me? Which may or may not be something you actually wanted to do or signed up for. However, in asking yourself those questions, you might eventually stumble upon the idea of a rather straightforward notion, which is simply, why would a god want to give people this power? And the answer to a question like that is summed up through a variety of means, though in a game like this there are certainly exceptions to every rule. But in most circumstances, gods are forbidden these days at the time of Baldur's Gate 3 from directly interfering with mortals. It used to be a very common occurrence, where gods have at times even walked the world, so often they employ mortals these days to do it for them. However, as I mentioned, there are exceptions to every rule, and more often than not, gods are still able to act within their own sphere of influence, which is why we can still see them do things like manifest avatars, but most of the time they simply act indirectly through things like clerics. And that gives you even more fuel for the class fantasy portion of a cleric. In addition to the deity you serve, how you came into that service, what exactly is their agenda, what is the indirect thing they need you to do, or are you simply spreading the word of that deity? Perhaps you simply believe in the principles they espouse. So while the specifics are up to you, a cleric is nonetheless beholden to their deity, and everything they do is to ultimately fulfill that goal. But in a world like the Forgotten Realms, where we have deities like Lathander, whose reverence for life and things like renewal might have their clerics going around trying to redeem people who have done terrible things, or simply pointing anyone in general towards a new beginning, is certainly one interpretation incantation, but we also have gods of murder like Baal, who will almost certainly be trying to get clerics to perform said murders. And while those are two extremes, there's plenty of things in between, such as Joaquin, the goddess of trade, or Ogma, the god of knowledge, who would of course have very different goals related to their sphere of influence and spreading it as far as possible. So as such, the class fantasy of a cleric is incredibly diverse, and it's ultimately going to be what you make of it, which is in no small part down to the deity you serve and the domain in which you are serving them with. So with that in mind, we're going to move on to some general class mechanics and things before we circle back to domains at the end of the video. So let's talk general information. First up, the most important ability score for a cleric is Wisdom. This is because they are ultimately full spellcasters who are granted spells from their divine deity, and all of that spellcasting runs off of Wisdom, in addition to several of their class features. So Wisdom is by far the most important. However, from there, like many classes, you have some wiggle room. If you want to be a little more melee focused, you're probably going to want something like Strength and some Constitution, but the exact makeup really just depends on what you're doing with the class. From there though, let's talk proficiencies. It's worth a mention that depending on the domain you choose, you will get some extra proficiencies on top of this, but for the base class, they come with light and medium armor proficiency, as well as simple weapons, with the mace being a particularly popular choice. From there, let's talk spellcasting a bit. As I mentioned, clerics are full divine casters. That is to say, if they were to go to level 20, they would ultimately get level 9 spells, but as the level cap in Baldur's Gate 3 is 12, they will get 6th level spells if they make it that far. However, there are a few things that make this spellcasting unique. They are prepared casters, which means they have to prepare their spells, but they don't have to worry about ever learning any of them, because when they hit the appropriate level, they will automatically learn at a base level all of the spells available to a cleric at that level. And then from that list, they'll be able to prepare so many a day based on their level and their wisdom modifier, which makes up their base form of spell casting. And then they'll be using their spell slots to cast these, which increases with their level like everyone else's typically. However, clerics do get a little bit extra here because depending on the domain they have, they're going to get some extra spells. As they level up, they will add domain spells to their spell list, but these spells are also always prepared, meaning you don't have to prepare them in addition to your regular spells. Any domain spell is automatically available to cast at all times, provided you have the spell slots to do so. And that's incredibly important because that's how we get the specific things a cleric might want from their spell casting outside of the more general cleric spell list, which they'll get all of. So while the normal cleric spell list includes things like healing as well as a little bit of offense via things like inflict wounds or guiding bolt, if they were to say pick up the light domain, then right at level 1 they would get something like burning hands, and then at 3rd level they could even pick up scorching ray, which they would not typically get. So domains provide an extra way to diversify their spell list a little bit beyond what would normally be available. But now let's talk about some of the other class mechanics available to us, which are going to start out with Channel Divinity. Starting at 2nd level, clerics get a variety of powers based on the domain they have chosen, which will allow them to channel the divinity of their god into some sort of special power. At first you can only do this once per day, but eventually when you hit level 6 it'll go up and you'll get an extra charge of this, which will help you use it more often. Now for the most part, Channel Divinity is determined by our domain like I mentioned. However, every cleric gets the option to turn undead with this. Turn undead essentially forces undead to run away from you if they fail a wisdom save, at which point the only thing it is allowed to do is run as far away from a cleric as it is possible for it to do so. And then at level 5, that actually becomes Destroy Undead. Any undead creature that fails that saving throw and is below a certain threshold of power is just immediately destroyed. And then at 10th level, clerics pick up Divine Intervention. They can essentially call on their deity to directly intervene on their behalf. In the tabletop version, you roll a dice to see whether or not this is successful and the deity actually shows up to do anything. And then what the deity does specifically is usually up for interpretation. So how that's going to work in a video game is a little vague until we see it at launch. However, it's worth mentioning that a common suggestion here is that a deity could make use of literally any cleric spell of any level as an appropriate response to your call for aid, all the way up to something like 9th level Cleric spells. But again, that's just a suggestion, and what Larian does with that is kind of wide open. Now from there, let's talk deities and domains. We talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the video, but here I want to go into a little more of mechanical detail, so to speak. Now, generally speaking, in the tabletop version of this, you would make a cleric with a divine domain that is relevant to the appropriate deity. For instance, you would take the nature domain if you were serving a nature god. You would take the knowledge domain if you were serving someone like Mistra, the goddess of magic. And then there are quite a few deities who are able to be served with a variety of domains. For instance, the life domain applies to a lot of deities, because life is a very broad concept. But generally, these two things would sort of theme together based on the god and what you want to do with that cleric. However, in Baldur's Gate 3, at least in early access, there is no such restriction, and officially in the rules of the tabletop version, each deity comes with suggested domains, though at the table you can ultimately roll this any way you want, which is a little more in line with what Baldur's Gate 3 is doing with them. As it stands, though, there's nothing preventing you of becoming the cleric of an evil deity and then picking like the life domain. Now, whether or not that ultimately gets trimmed in based on the fact that that's sort of antithetical to the way some of the deities work, or whether they simply leave it free form for the sake of role-playing, remains to be seen, but given how they generally want people to be able to do the things they want without restricting them unnecessarily, I don't think this is something they're likely to change, but nonetheless something to keep in mind for sure. So as it stands, regardless of the deity you're worshipping in Baldur's Gate 3, we will have access to the 7 domains that are available in the player's handbook for 5th edition D&D. There are many more domains than this, but nonetheless, the ones we will have access to are knowledge, life, light, nature, tempest, trickery, and war. 3 of these are currently in the game right now via early access, and the other 4 will be available on launch. Right now, we have access to life, light, and trickery, though as you might imagine, all of these do something unique for your character. However, much like a wizard subclasses, most of them follow a general template, which I'm going to explain now as a sort of broad overview. So right away, when you pick up a domain at level 1, you'll get access to a few bonus features that are specific to an individual domain. For instance, the life domain picks up proficiency with heavy armor right at level 1. The light domain gets access to the light cantrip for free. The Tempest and War domains both give you access to heavy armor proficiency and martial weapons, alongside a few other things. Knowledge, for instance, gives you some proficiency with a few different skills. But in addition to those bonus effects, we also get the spells associated with each domain that will be automatically added and always prepared to our spell list for us to cast appropriately. After those things, however, at 1st, 6th, and 8th level, we will gain some sort of class mechanic. Typically, these are unique, however, sometimes they are just extra channel divinity features, though every domain gets an extra channel divinity feature at level 2 as well. All of this, naturally, is themed towards the domain you have chosen, with channel divinity in particular really reflecting that. For instance, the trickery domain will allow you to throw up an illusory distraction of sorts that can keep enemies from attacking you, though this does require concentration. However, compared to the Tempest domain's channel divinity ability of simply maximizing any lightning or thunder damage you happen to do, you can see that some of these might benefit a particular character more than others. Now, for our class features at 1st, 6th, and 8th level, these tend to be more specific. For instance, a trickery domain cleric will be able to grant people advantage on dexterity stealth throws, meaning they'll have an easier time hiding from people, whereas at 6th level they pick up an extra channel divinity that allows them to become invisible for a turn, whereas at 8th level they can add some poison damage to their attacks once per turn. So as you can see, pretty much every domain has something that leans into what they're doing. Tempest allows you to deal a bunch of thunder or lightning damage through various means. At 8th level they can add it directly. At 1st level they can use their reaction to hit people with thunder damage when they get hit. A war domain cleric gets the ability to make weapon attacks with their bonus action. However, it's worth a mention that the 8th level ability for these almost always adds the ability to deal some amount of extra damage with your attacks, typically in the form of 1d8 of whatever kind of relevant damage that domain would be doing. Or for the more caster-oriented domains, it will simply add your wisdom modifier to the damage of your cantrips, whereas the level 1 and 6th level class features for each domain tend to be a little more specific. Though more often than not, honestly, just the name of the domain pretty much sums up what they're going to be good at. For instance, life domain clerics make very good healers. Light domain clerics actually make very good spellcasters, as they get access to a lot more offensive stuff like Fireball at level 5. Tempest and War do very good in melee combat, as they get a lot of bonuses to those things. Trickery is great at giving you extra options for stealth, and because of all those choices and options you have here, alongside the regular full spellcasting class that is the Cleric, all makes for a ton of options available to you, which again makes this class one of the most diverse in terms of playstyle. So when it comes to playing a Cleric, that's largely going to come down to you and the domain you have chosen. Though as a general rule, all Clerics are decent at healing and support spellcasting. This is because their base Cleric spell list that they will get regardless of how else you've built that character makes them good at those things. This includes things like buffing allies, healing them directly with healing spells, and in some cases simply debuffing the enemy. Clerics get a lot of those types of spells no matter what, and thus those roles are always available to you. From there though, it really comes down to the subclass you've chosen. For instance, if you pick up the light domain, you're going to be a pretty decent offensive spellcaster, so you might use that to supplement what you're already doing, to make you a more versatile spellcaster in general, while not trying to engage the front line too much, but rather hang back and simply heal and use spells where appropriate, whereas a Tempest Cleric or a War Cleric would very much so be up in the middle of things with heavy armor, martial weapons, doing as much damage as possible with any weapon you happen to have felt like giving them, which makes Clerics as a class very diverse in what they're able to do and how they choose to do specific things. But because of all of the various things they can get right at level 1 thanks to their domains, such as heavy armor and martial weapons right out of the gate with certain domains on top of any other benefits they get right at level 1, such as light domain using their reaction to impose disadvantage on people, or the Tempest Cleric's ability to do some damage as a reaction as well, makes them a relatively popular multi-classing choice. And while the roleplay of multi-classing a Cleric might be a little awkward as they ultimately serve gods, there are nonetheless a few popular options. Fighter, of course, being at the top of the list for their action surge and their fighting style they can pick right at level 1, being nice additions, especially if you want to go with a more martially focused Cleric, which is a similar case for Rangers who also use Wisdom as a stat, which makes for a nice overlap there as well. And another popular choice here is Paladin. Besides being of all of them probably the most thematically correct way to go, a couple levels of Paladin can get you access to things like Divine Smite, which a Cleric will have even more spell slots to make use of, and if you're already using something like the Tempest or War domains, that can be an especially good one. Though you wouldn't want to overlap that one too much, as Paladins work off Charisma and not Wisdom. Though things like Divine Smite, you don't necessarily need the Charisma for. Though, as you can probably tell from the length of this video compared to many of the other class overviews we've done, Clerics have a lot going on, both in terms of their class fantasy and the diversity of their roles in combat. Because whether it is a character on the front lines of a battlefield in service to the god of war, or a healer stitching together the wounds of the injured to make sure that they see the hope of a new dawn, all the way to the more sinister plots of a Cleric who has set out to sow death and destruction in the name of an evil deity, all of which would be valid options that the Cleric class can provide a unique experience for. So with all of that in mind, I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something and found it interesting. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But more than anything, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my class overview for the Druid in Baldur's Gate 3 just ahead of its launch, where we'll be going over things like the class fantasy of a Druid on top of its class mechanics and specifically how it is in Baldur's Gate 3. So with that in mind, there has been some changes to this class, mostly around wild shape in particular, which sees us transforming into a variety of animals. But nonetheless, as I'm sure many people know, Druids are a defender of nature. They upkeep a balance of many elements that keeps the world from being drawn into one of the elemental planes. And they keep this balance via their full spell casting ability on top of their many, obviously nature-based powers. So with that in mind, let's talk about the class fantasy of a Druid. In many ways, I would say it speaks for itself, but there are some intricacies I think that are worth mentioning. At a very simple level, Druids are, as I mentioned, protectors of nature. They seek to uphold the balance between the natural world and its elements, but also keeping people from just outright destroying what is left of natural areas as well. In many early editions of D&D, it was actually required for Druids to be of a neutral alignment, and this class, along with all of the others in 5th edition D&D, have largely moved away from alignment systems, but that neutral alignment was intended to reflect a Druid's preservation of balance, as mostly a Druid will do what is required of them to maintain that balance, and that doesn't necessarily have anything evil or good or lawful or chaotic associated with it. It's simply a representation of how the natural order of things works, so to speak. That said, Druids are ultimately people, which means they have their own inclinations and can choose to interpret how best to protect nature in many different ways. We actually see an example of this in Baldur's Gate 3 with the two groups of Druids we encounter. So when it comes to playing a Druid, I think one of the main things to keep in mind is your approach to preserving said balance does have some room for interpretation that doesn't always equate itself with simply being polite and in harmony with everyone around you. But some other aspects of a Druid to consider are where their power comes from. Druids tap into the divine power of nature itself. This can be reflected by nature and its surroundings literally giving them their power, or it can manifest itself as power from a nature deity. But it's important to remember that, much like a Paladin in that way, a Druid's devotion to any individual god isn't necessarily a requirement of their powers. That is left open for you to roleplay a little bit, but it's very possible for a Druid to have access to all their spells and everything without actually worshipping any particular deity. It is very possible for the land itself to grant them this power. And while many Druids work alone, it's also not uncommon for them to come together and form Druid circles. And generally, members of these circles will have similar perspectives on how best to approach protecting their land, which can usually manifest itself by going all in on their nature-based magic, as they are full spellcasters after all, or they can take a more aggressive approach and transform themselves into various animals to take on problems more directly. Be it as a hermit living in the wilds or a more sociable member of a druidic circle seeking to protect sacred grounds, Druids ultimately strive to uphold and protect the natural order, and your interpretation of that and how you approach that sacred duty might even lead you to an adventuring life, and even into more populated areas like a city where you might try to help a city cope without decimating the land around it. But from there, let's actually dive into the mechanics of a Druid, starting with some general information. First of all, their primary ability score is Wisdom. This is used for their casting ability alongside several other things. You have a good bit of leeway in what you do with all of your other ability scores, however, especially if you are planning on wild shaping, because turning into other animals will actually replace your base ability scores with the new animal versions. So if you're planning on engaging in martial combat via wild shape, having a high strength or dexterity score isn't necessarily important, but if you're planning on playing a more caster-focused role, you might want to go into Constitution for the extra life, as that is pretty much universally useful, or something like Dexterity for the extra armor class, as that and your medium armor can make you a little bit tankier. So you do have a good bit of leeway in the stats, but Wisdom is definitely the most important. Then we have our proficiencies. A Druid is proficient with light and medium armor as well as a shield, but for their weapons instead of being proficient with simple or martial weapons, they are proficient with a lot of things individually. Clubs, daggers, javelins, maces, quarterstaffs, scimitars, sickles, and spears. It was also important at one time for druids not to use metal armor in particular, and while the TTRPG still technically has a rule for it, in Baldur's Gate 3 in particular, it is not an issue, it's not something you have to pay attention to, and in the tabletop version it was kind of play it by ear at this point anyway, with that being a rule many people ignored. That said, another thing to keep in mind here is that if you are wild shaping as a druid, your armor isn't super important, as your AC is going to be using whatever the animal you wild shaped into's AC, or their natural AC, I should say, as they are unarmored, so exactly how important these proficiencies are can vary a little bit. From there, let's talk spellcasting. As I mentioned, druids are full spellcasters, which means they will get 9th level spells, and they have a pretty extensive spell list that is capable of being both offensive, defensive in nature, or utility based. They can really do a lot with their casting, as is the case with most full spellcasters. However, because their magic is ultimately divine in nature, pun very much so intended, they are prepared casters, meaning that when they reach an appropriate level to learn new spells, they get all of their new spells for that level of spell right away. However, they can only prepare so many of these at a time, which makes up the spells available for us to actually use. As you might imagine though, the big focus with their spell casting is elemental magic and things that interact with nature in some way. This can see us conjuring animals, using vines to ensnare our enemies, calling insects to help us out. At higher levels, druids are even capable of doing things like causing an earthquake. However, with the limit of 6th level spells that will be in Baldur's Gate 3 as our level 12 cap is imposed, we can still do things such as conjure elementals, spread diseases via contagion, call down lightning from the heavens, which numbers just a few of their abilities. However, while some of these spells are even directly related to our melee abilities, such as Shillelagh, giving us a magical club or staff that we can do pretty decent damage with at low levels, this ultimately comes at a cost because, like most full spellcasters, we do not get an extra attack like a martially focused class would. However, we'll talk a little bit more about that as part of Wild Shape, which naturally brings me to Wild Shape, sort of the cornerstone, I would say, of druidic abilities, and the thing they are most known for. Druids have the ability to transform into various animals. In the tabletop version, this is pretty wide open. There's a limit on the strength of a creature you could actually transform into, which starts at 2nd level when you actually get Wild Shape, and then at 4th and 8th level, the strength of what you can turn into increases. However, as we are ultimately playing a video game here, it's a little more limited than that, as we have our choice from a variety of forms, and what is available in early access is certainly not everything by any means, as we know there will be transformations outside of what you can see here. But another thing to keep in mind is that they've actually changed what these animals are capable of as well. For instance, none of them have access to multi-attack at level 2, which would allow them to attack more than once. This is probably for balancing reasons. However, as we're going to get into here in a minute, one of the ways you can play a druid via a subclass is to focus on wild shaping, which is more involved in close quarters combat where an extra attack is very important. So it's likely they will add that portion of what these animals can do later on down the road as opposed to their strict implementation in the TTRPG. So my point being, what these animals are capable of and how they're implemented is going to be a bit different. Nonetheless, though, turning into various animals has its perks, with bears being able to tank, badgers being able to burrow, wolves being able to inspire your party to move a little farther on their turn, or distract enemies even. But we also have the option of a cat, which will allow us to stealth into places we likely shouldn't be. So much like the TTRPG, the wild shaping gives us options for a variety of situations that will likely only become more useful as the game progresses. That said, believe it or not, spellcasting and wild shape make up the bulk of a druid's class features and class mechanics. What we have left to talk about is the subclasses, because outside of just wild shaping and spellcasting in general, every other class mechanic we're going to get as a druid comes directly from our subclass, which is one of our druidic circles. There are ultimately going to be 3 of these in the game, which are the Circle of Land, the Circle of the Moon, or a Spore Druid. Now, Land and Moon are pretty straightforward. Circle of the Land focuses in on spellcasting. This is going to give you an extra cantrip, it's going to give you natural recovery. Right when you pick a Druidic Circle at level 2, which is unusual, normally you get a subclass right away at level 1 or level 3, but Druids get theirs at 2. Natural recovery will allow you to recover some of your spell slots, which will keep you casting that much longer. Now in the TTRPG, you are supposed to pick a type of land, like a desert or a forest, grassland, that type of thing, and then you would get spells associated with that as you leveled up that wouldn't count against the number of your prepared spells. It looks like that's been done away with in Baldur's Gate 3, at least in early access, because when you hit level 3 when that's supposed to start, it doesn't come up. So if they actually wind up adding that, I guess we shall see. But beyond that, a Circle of the Land Druid will still at level 6 get Land Stride, which makes them immune to difficult terrain, provided it's non-magical, alongside passing through non-magical plants without a hassle, such as if they're poisonous, have thorns, etc. And then we have advantage on saving throws against plants that are magically created, such as the Entangle spell. At 10th level, we should become immune to poison and disease and be unable to be charmed or frightened by elementals or fae. And with our level 12 cap, that's the important stuff to know. That brings us to Circle of the Moon, though. Circle of the Moon focuses more on the wild shaping aspect of a druid. So if you wanted to be a druid that engages in close quarters combat as an animal, this would be the way to go. Right upon picking Circle of the Moon, they pick up Combat Wild Shape, which allows us to use our wild shape as a bonus action rather than a full action. So we could potentially turn into something and then also attack in the same round. In addition to that though, while in wild shape we can consume our spell slots that we would not otherwise be able to use to instead recover health at a rate of 1d8 per level of spell that you consume. Another part of Circle of the Moon is that it's supposed to let you transform into stronger versions of various creatures, that is to say creatures with higher challenge ratings, but it's hard to say exactly how this is going to be implemented in Baldur's Gate 3, so we shall see in that regard. But overall, they get stronger wild shape forms. And then at level 6, our attacks in beast form count as magical when it comes to overcoming resistances or immunity to regular weapons. And then at 10th level, we can actually expend 2 uses of wild shape to transform instead into an elemental of some kind. An important note there is that typically your wild shaping is limited to 2 times per day, so whether or not we see an increase to that number in Baldur's Gate 3 also remains to be seen. But either way, the uses are replenished on a short or long rest, which makes them pretty easy to recharge. And as I mentioned earlier, it's good to remember that your ability scores will change based on what you transform into, which includes things like your AC. So the difference between that and your human form while spellcasting is going to wind up being important, especially because you can't actually talk while you are an animal. That's something you'll have to revert out of beast form to do, and in many cases, if you are in beast form, other members of your party will instead be called to speak into a conversation in your absence. That, though, does bring us to our final subclass, which is the Spore Druid. Spore Druids are fairly interesting, mostly because the Circle of Spores is about finding beauty in decay, because ultimately things like mold and fungi have a purpose in the natural order. We don't know exactly how this is going to be implemented as it is not in early access, but some of their chief abilities in the TTRPG are the Halo of Spores ability they'll get right at 2nd level, which surrounds you with invisible necrotic spores that are harmless until you make use of them. When a creature that you can see moves within 10 feet of you or starts your turn next to you, you can use your reaction to deal a small amount of necrotic damage to them against their constitution save versus your spell save, which will give you a nice bit of extra damage. This will actually increase as you level up, which makes it a nice way to get some extra damage. Also at 2nd level though, they pick up Symbiotic Entity. This allows you to expend uses of your wild shape to awaken the spores around you to instead give you temporary hit points for each level you have as a druid. While this ability is active, your Halo of Spores actually gets to roll a 2nd die of damage, effectively doubling it, and your melee weapon will deal extra necrotic damage if you happen to hit anything with it as well. This lasts until you use Wild Shape, lose all your temporary hit points, or 10 minutes have passed. At 6th level though, they get Fungal Infestation. This gives them the ability to reanimate corpses. Basically, when anything dies within 10 feet of you, you can use your reaction to animate it with a single hit point, at which point it becomes essentially a zombie, and is capable only of attacking your enemies mindlessly. But its 1 hit point makes it a very squishy enemy. Now, if Baldur's Gate 3 adjusts that to make those zombies stronger than just, say, 1 hit point, that could be a lot of fun to mess around with, but even without that, it's still a pretty cool ability. Lastly, at 10th level, they get Spreading Spores, which allows them to, instead of using Halo of Spores, create a field or cube of them in a roughly 10-foot radius, which will then deal your Halo of Spores damage to anything that moves into it or starts its turn inside of it. This is, however, exclusive with Halo of Spores. You can either do this or use regular Halo of Spores, so potentially useful if there is a large group of enemies. That way you can hit them all. That said, that pretty much does it for class mechanics as far as druids go, so now let's talk a little bit about playing a druid. Playing a druid is, for the most part, a pretty good time. They have a very strong class fantasy, they have things that are unique to them, and that ultimately gives this class a very strong identity and makes other classes want to multi-class into them to get various features from them. But when it comes to playing a druid, the first thing you want to ask yourself really is, do you want to focus on the casting or the wild shaping? Because your subclass choice here is largely going to make this decision for you. Because while you can do both, it's definitely a situation where it's better to focus, though having the options will give you some versatility. Because even as a Circle of the Moon druid focusing on wild shape, you're still going to be a full spellcaster, so you can still make use of all of your spells before combat even, because the druid spell list is very strong even without the Circle of Land extra benefits. And while you can't cast spells in wild shape, what you will be able to do is use some spells to buff your party members before combat starts, for instance, with things like Barkskin potentially, or some of your own healing magic. And if you instead choose to go the Circle of Land route, you'll still occasionally have uses for wild shape, such as turning into a cat to sneak into something. And that bit of versatility really adds a lot to what a druid can do, both on and off the battlefield, even if generally speaking you're going to specialize in either casting or wild shape. And being able to do all those things and adjust your wild shape on the fly to any given situation that you might need is a pretty big boon to just about any party. But another thing to keep in mind about druids is that they make for a few popular multi-classing options. A very popular one is to mix them with a Barbarian, because a Barbarian's rage mechanic will actually work with wild shape. And that combined with the temporary hit points of a wild shape, and you've got a great tank capable of dealing some real damage. Another option is to mix them with a Cleric, as they are both wisdom-based spellcasters, and taking a small dip into Cleric to grab something from a domain that you might want could be really useful, such as Tempest Cleric is always a popular choice. And then, as always, fighters remain useful for everyone, because 2 levels of fighter will give you Action Surge. But ultimately, no matter how you do it, there's a lot of ways to play a druid. They are a class with a very strong identity and class fantasy that can do a great deal, from offensive spellcasting to support spellcasting, transforming into all sorts of animals to either perform in combat or simply a non-combat role, such as sneaking into places. Druids have a lot to offer a party, which is why they are a fairly popular class, and I very much so expect that to continue being the case in Baldur's Gate 3. All of that said though, that has been our class overview for the Druid. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time continuing our class series ahead of Baldur's Gate 3, this time with the Fighter, a class that excels in various forms of martial combat, all of which we'll be exploring in this video, but we are sticking mostly to the class fantasy, general class mechanics, and we're not getting too deep into the math of these things, as that is better saved for build videos. That said, going into this, Fighter is a very broad term, and as such, it can be a little vague in representing what the class is actually supposed to be. Because if you assume everyone who picks up a stick and tries to hit something with it is a fighter, you would actually be very much so wrong. And because of that, the class has a lot more nuance than it might initially appear. And that brings us to the first section of this video, the class fantasy of a fighter. As I just mentioned, not everybody who picks up a stick is a fighter. In fact, the vast majority of soldiers and mercenaries you might run into in the Forgotten Realms, our world setting, are not actually fighters, because even a level 1 fighter is trained and proficient in all types of martial combat, even though they will go on to specialize in one form in particular. So as a representation of that training, fighters are, by definition, veteran soldiers, military officers, trained bodyguards, dedicated knights, among other things. What really sets them apart is their robust wealth of experience, even from level 1, which is going to be heads and tails above what the common person would have. So when it comes to class fantasy, a lot of what a fighter has to offer, in addition to just their varied and many types of fighting, are where that training actually came from. So where other classes go very specific in where your power comes from and how it manifests, fighters have that option left very much so open. Maybe you got into the adventuring life trying to escape a life in a farm or something. Maybe you received military training as part of some army you were a part of. Or maybe you want to take the Batman route where somebody killed someone close to you and you spent a great deal of time training to take your revenge. All of which would be valid options for creating a fighter. But beyond just the role play of how to become a fighter, it's important to remember that they excel at martial combat in general, and they can specialize in any particular type of it. So whether they're charging into battle with a two-handed weapon or using a more traditional sword and board approach, you can work that into their backstory in some way, because while they are proficient with all of these things, they will specialize in one of them. And because of that, compared to other classes, such as a Barbarian who operates on rage and instinct, or a Paladin whose martial prowess is augmented by divine power, fighters are just incredibly skilled. They have trained and excel at martial combat to a point where others can only hope to keep up by utilizing sometimes magical means. With that said, let's talk about some of the other information and class mechanics a fighter has to offer, starting with our general information. Ability score wise, you have some options here. Typically, you're going to focus on either strength or dexterity, depending on the types of weapons you're going to be using, or if you want to use a bow. If you want to be an archer, you need dexterity. If you want to use finesse weapons, you need dexterity. Otherwise, you want strength. It's also possible that you might want a little bit of intelligence if we pick up the Eldritch Knight subclass, which allows us to pick up a little bit of magic, but even that would be secondary to strength or dexterity. Constitution's always a good way to go, especially if you're on the front line as well. But your primary ability score is going to be strength or dexterity. From there, however, in terms of proficiencies, you get essentially all of them, all armor, shields, simple, and martial weapons. This is representative of your training with all types of combat. From there, let's talk class mechanics a bit. Starting right at level 1, a fighter has the option of picking one of 6 fighting styles: archery, defense, dueling, great weapon fighting, protection, or two-weapon fighting. These are going to give you a boost to the type of fighting you would like to partake in. So naturally, just pick the one that represents what you actually want to do. These will provide you a decent bonus to that style of fighting. Also at level 1, they pick up Second Wind. This is a free heal you can use once per short rest, which keeps you in the fight that much longer, again representative of your extensive training. Now starting at 2nd level is where things get really interesting, because this is when we get Action Surge. Action Surge is one of the better abilities in 5th edition D&D period. It is what makes a 2-level fighter multi-class useful for almost everyone, and while it's not necessarily the best option at all times, it is universally useful because Action Surge allows you to take an extra action once per short or long rest on your turn. You actually get more uses of this if you were to hit like level 17, but with our level cap of 12, that's not going to come into play. This alone, especially at higher levels, is going to give you the opportunity to make mini attacks, and coupled with an already high-powered build, you can do a ton of damage with Action Surge. So while it is, in essence, a very simple ability, never underestimate it. Now, at 5th level, like pretty much all martially focused classes, we get our extra attack, allowing us to attack twice every turn. And then last for base class mechanics, we have Indomitable. Starting at 9th level, you'll get to reroll a saving throw that you fail, giving you the possibility of succeeding at it instead. You can do this once per long rest. With our level cap of 12, that will be all, though normally this would also increase as you level up, with the second one actually beginning right at level 13. Now, the rest of a fighter's mechanics come down to their chosen subclass, or their martial archetype. You'll pick this at level 3, and these are meant to be representative of your approach to perfecting your combat style. There will ultimately be 3 of them: Battlemaster, Eldritch Knight, and Champion. Champion is not in early access, so I won't have footage to show you, but Battlemaster and Eldritch Knight very much so are. Battlemaster, I must confess, is a personal favorite of mine, as this gives us access to special combat maneuvers that run off of a resource called Superiority Dice. Right away, we'll learn 3 maneuvers, getting a few more as we level up at 7th and 10th level, all of which use our Superiority Dice. We'll start with 4 D8s that can then turn into D10s at level 10, and we can potentially earn 1 more Superiority Dice at level 7, which would give us a total of 5. Once we use these on our combat maneuvers, they can be restored on a short rest or a long rest, and these ultimately fuel our special maneuvers. These can be all sorts of things, such as pushing attack, which will push an enemy back when you hit them, or riposte, where an enemy will try to hit you, and if they miss, you can use your reaction to use a Superiority Dice to make an attack against them, or something like disarming attack, which will relieve them of their weapons when it hits. In all of these, when you use the Superiority Dice, it will add the roll of that dice to the damage typically, and these maneuvers both add damage and a lot of versatility to what you can inflict as a fighter on the enemy besides just damage. For instance, disarming them and taking away their weapon is an incredibly strong move if it manages to hit. It's also worth mentioning that these maneuvers can also be used with a bow as well, so if you wanted to be an archer and still use Battlemaster, you can very much so do that. But Battlemaster is a really fun way to play the game. Now, as an alternative, you could pick, say, Eldritch Knight, though, which is a more Gish-style character, that is to say, a magic and melee character pushed together to make a sort of battle mage. Eldritch Knights focus on learning a little bit of magic, specifically from Abjuration and the Evocation schools. This is going to allow us to learn some spells from the Wizard spell list, and then of course use them in combat. Now, ultimately though, Eldritch Knights are considered 1/3 casters, which is pretty rare in 5th edition D&D, and as a result of this, if you were to take a fighter all the way to level 12, you would only get 2nd level spells. And because these are wizard spells, they use intelligence as the ability score associated with them. Now, what makes this particular subclass interesting is once you start getting to around level 7, and then again at level 10, we pick up a few class features. Specifically, at 7, we get War Magic, which allows us to, when casting a cantrip as an action, make a weapon attack as a bonus action. And then at level 10, they pick up Eldritch Strike, which causes our weapon attacks when hitting a creature to cause disadvantage on the next saving throws against a spell you cast before the end of your next turn. And depending on the spells you pick and how you want to approach this, they can be a fun way to play, again, a sort of battle mage character while sticking to one particular class and not having to worry about multi-classing into things, etc. That said, then we have our final subclass, which is the Champion. This one is not in early access, and I would be almost surprised if we don't see some sort of small changes to it in Baldur's Gate 3, and that's largely because the Champion is all about maximizing criticals, and they can also pick up an additional fighting style at level 10. But at level 3, and then normally at level 15, they increase the range at which they can perform a critical attack, which is done by rolling a natural 20 normally, but a Champion only has to roll a 19 or 20 right at level 3, or at level 15, this reduces all the way to 18 to 20, which again just makes them able to critically hit more often. But because because their best abilities don't come until after level 12, all they would get in Baldur's Gate 3 is the improved critical at level 3, a bonus to strength, dexterity, and constitution checks that don't already have your proficiency bonus, and the additional fighting style at level 10, which is frankly a little underwhelming. So ultimately, I wouldn't be surprised if they make some changes to Champion for the actual game, but the main thing it does is increase your chance of doing critical hits. The rest of it is all just passive stuff, and in a video game that's not particularly fun. That said, certainly not an archetype to be underestimated, because there is some power and simplicity sometimes, but realistically, I think a lot of people will multi-class into Champion Fighter to level 3 specifically for the improved critical before moving into something like a rogue. That said, with our subclasses out of the way, let's actually start talking about playing a fighter. Your options as a fighter are to basically just to try to hit things, unless you are playing an Eldritch Knight, in which case you'll have some spells available to you, and even then it's usually cast, cantrip, weapon attack, provided of course you've hit level 7, and before that it's still mostly just hitting things. Which means that when it comes to playing a fighter, you're either going to be up on the front lines dealing damage, or potentially playing as an archer and being a bit farther back. It's also possible, of course, to build a fighter as your tank while at the same time dealing some decent damage, and if you're using something like a Battle Master fighter, you can even have the chance to take weapons away from enemies, control the battlefield a little bit through positioning, that kind of thing. So a lot of the gameplay around a fighter is going to amount to things like that, which is a relatively simple play style, but ultimately, I think that's probably best for newer players to the game, which is why fighters retain their popularity despite being relatively simple, because ultimately they are incredibly reliable damage dealers that can be difficult to kill, which makes them especially useful for players new to the game just trying to figure out how everything works, who don't want to have to worry about knowing what each and every spell does, for instance. But beyond just playing a pure fighter, what makes them especially popular is actually their multi-classing, because as I mentioned, 2 levels in a fighter multi-class will get you access to Action Surge, which is universally useful. However, just going 3 levels into fighter can then take you into, say, a Battle Master archetype, which can give you access to your special maneuvers and superiority dice, which combined with Action Surge could add a lot potentially to another martially focused class. But you could also pick up Champion for the extra crit range. And all of that together makes fighters the epitome of simple but effective when it comes to 5th edition D&D. Their class fantasy is straightforward, of course, but very open to interpretation, how you came by your training, what kind of person you are, and mechanics that can deal a very good amount of damage, help you control the battlefield, and learn about the game at the same time. So it's a class that is very beginner friendly, but very, very useful for veterans who know how to make the most of it. So while it can absolutely seem like a class that is just prone to hitting things, the skill ceiling for this is really about using the fighter to control the battlefield. In any event, though, fighters personify martial excellence in a way that just about everyone else needs magic to keep up with. That said, that's been our look at the fighter in the upcoming Baldur's Gate 3. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a thing or two. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But more than anything, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the final video in our class overview series for Baldur's Gate 3 with, of course, the Monk. This one had to be last, though, because in the early access period of the game, the Monk was not present, and when they announced the Monk was coming, they mentioned that it had seen some changes to help make up for the fact that it is considered pretty weak in the tabletop version. And I'm glad I didn't just cover the tabletop version, because they did in fact make some significant changes to the subclasses in particular. Most of the base class remained the same, however. With that in mind, before we dive into this, these overviews are focused more on the class fantasy on top of the general mechanics and things to expect. So if you're looking for a number crunching build video, this isn't that. This is simply talking about things like the role-playing potential on top of some of the things they can do mechanically. That said, I do want to mention here at the beginning that I really do enjoy some of the changes that Larian has made here, because a decent amount of them have simply moved up and altered abilities that the Monk would get later on in their level progression past level 12. I like to kick these particular videos off with talking about the class fantasy of, in this case, the Monk, So with that in mind, what even is a monk in the context of Dungeons & Dragons, which is a normally very fantasy-focused setting, where a monk might seem like a slightly strange addition? Because while monks in this particular franchise do in fact live secluded lives, often in the form of communal living with other members of their monastic order as they pursue some goal. More specifically, monks do two things that make them very unique. They strive for physical perfection, trying to hone their skills, and it is through this practice that they learn to manipulate ki energy, which here in D&D is simply the life energy that flows through all living beings. Monks manage to attune to this and then manipulate it to push themselves far beyond what a typical person would be capable of. That, by itself, means that while monks tend to be a very physical class in the sense that they are either throwing literal punches or using very simple weapons like a quarterstaff or potentially a club even, they also have some almost magical ability that runs off their class resource of ki. This takes the form of points that we'll get as we level up, and we can spend that on our more supernatural abilities, which are typically just slightly reskinned versions of other types of spells. And I do want to emphasize that I just said spell, because what ki energy is in the context of this universe is one of the fundamental forms of magic that flow through the fantasy world here. It is very difficult for most people to tap into, which is what makes monks unique, their ability to tap into a magic source that most people simply can't. And this is why much of what they can do with their abilities replicates what other magic does, because essentially that's just what it is. They've simply learned to harness it in a different way than others have, which I personally find a very interesting prospect. Though when it comes to the roleplay side of things, more particularly when it comes to playing as a monk, these are generally people that in fact grew up in a cloister of other monks, an order or a sect dedicated to a particular philosophy, so to speak. And because of this, monks as a result of that background have in previous editions of D&D been required to be of a lawful alignment, and while we can still see some of that reflected in 5th edition today, most of the alignment system stuff has largely been done away with, so you don't have to play it that way by any means. However, while a monk has almost certainly grown up in one of these cloisters, what that entailed can vary wildly, because what monks get up to in D&D varies quite wildly. Some of them are simply protectors of the surrounding landscape, with them actually regularly interacting with towns and villages nearby in order to both protect them as well as to facilitate trade to support their own living, while still other cloisters of monks have a more sinister tone to them. Some of them can in fact work for, say, a local wealthy baron or some other wealthy patron as paid assassins even. And because of this, for a monk to be seen as an adventurer, they typically are on some sort of personal quest. Are they looking for some amount of personal or spiritual growth that the cloister simply can't provide and they must go elsewhere for it? And combined with what I've said previously, this means that when it comes to creating a monk from a roleplay perspective, some things to keep in mind are what that monk's early life looked like. They almost certainly joined a cloister of other monks as a child, though maybe you'd like to spin a different tale and say maybe they apprenticed to some other already wandering monk, which is where they picked up their trade, but what that life looked like and then what led them to seek a life of adventuring, or at least a temporary stint in doing so, are questions you would want to think about. Though in a much more direct manner, monks are simply highly trained martial artists that can use their fists to destroy enemies as well as any other weapon. And that finally brings us to our general information section before we start talking about class mechanics. Starting with ability scores, monks typically want to focus on dexterity and wisdom. This is primarily because they are going to be unarmored, and through dexterity and a class feature, wisdom, they will stack AC despite not wearing armor otherwise, which means they still become quite tanky and difficult to hit in many situations, despite not actually wearing armor. And while it's possible to build a monk with strength, the only real time you would do that is more than likely if you were multi-classing something, because a monk by themselves is going to want dexterity for their fist attacks, which for a monk can use dexterity, but also because it gives them that extra AC and extra initiative to move faster in combat. And the reason we want wisdom is because our modifier for that ability score gets added onto our AC as well. Now, in terms of weapons and armor, monks keep it very simple. They do not wear any armor typically, which means they don't have proficiency for any of it. And when it comes to weapons, they get simple weapons on top of short swords. Though do keep in mind, unarmed is very much so a possible build here and can be very strong as well, but you do have the option of a quarterstaff or something if you would prefer. In the context of Baldur's Gate 3, this is a good time to mention that it's important to understand that armor is a type of item, which includes things like helmets, gloves, and boots, so this does not mean just the chest slot of your armor. Moreover, there will be a lot of items that are specific to the monk that are not coded as armor. Instead, they are coded as clothing, which will still allow you to wear a unique piece of gear that might have extra effects for you while not interfering with your bonuses to your AC from being unarmored. From there, though, let's talk about some of the class mechanics for the base monk, of which there are quite a few. First, though, right at level 1, they get a variety of abilities through the class feature Martial Arts. This technically does a few things for us. For starters, it allows us to use our dexterity instead of strength for our unarmed strikes and monk weapons specifically. We can also roll a d4 in place of normal damage for our unarmed strikes if it's not already higher than that. And we can also make unarmed strikes as a bonus action, provided we've attacked first. Also, right at level 1, we pick up Unarmored Defense. This is our wisdom modifier to our AC, which, remember, this actually stacks with dexterity and does not replace it. Also, here at level 1, we have a small change from the tabletop to the actual game. In the tabletop version, you don't start getting key points and your Flurry of Blows ability until level 2, but in Baldur's Gate 3, we get that right at level 1. Flurry of Blows simply allows us to make multiple attacks with our fists, dealing extra damage, and when combined with a regular attack can give us several hits with our unarmed strikes, dealing quite a bit of damage even though the individual hits can be a little low. Moreover, you can do this as a bonus action, so typically you would make a normal attack and then follow up with a Flurry of Blows, but it does cost key points. Now, some people familiar with the tabletop version might be aware that at the same time you would get Flurry of Blows, you would normally also pick up Patient Defense and Step of the Wind key abilities. However, those have been retained at level 2. Patient Defense has been altered slightly to force the enemy to take disadvantage on their attack rolls for a turn. This is because the dodge action does not exist in Baldur's Gate 3. And then we also pick up Step of the Wind, which is an incredibly strong movement ability that for our bonus action allows us to double our movement speed and also make a jump for just one turn. This gives us a nonsense amount of movement, more so than pretty much anyone else in a single turn. All of these do cost key points though, which you have a limited supply of. Also at level 2, we pick up Unarmored Movement. This gives us extra movement speed if we are not wearing armor of any sort. So again, if we're unarmored, we get to move farther than normal, giving us even more movement. This actually increases again at 9th level to give a not insubstantial boost to how far you can move in a turn. At 3rd level, we pick our subclass, but also deflect missiles. This allows us to use our reaction to lessen the damage from an incoming, say, arrow or crossbow bolt. At 4th level, they pick up slow fall, which allows them to use their reaction to reduce any falling damage they might take, which in Baldur's Gate 3 is resistance to it, which means half. At 5th level, we pick up extra attack, like basically every martial class, allowing us to make even more attacks per turn. And combined with the Monk's Flurry of Blows, that can be substantial. They also pick up Stunning Strike, which allows you to spend key points on trying to stun an enemy with one of your attacks. And then at 6th level, they pick up Key Empowered Strikes, which makes our unarmed attacks count as magical for the purposes of damage reduction. So when it comes to overcoming resistances, our hands are considered magic. At 7th level, we pick up Evasion and Stillness of Mind. Evasion reduces the damage you would take from area of effect things like, say, a fireball spell. Normally, you take half damage if you make the save against that. However, with Evasion, if we make the save, we take 0 damage and just half normally. Stillness of Mind allows you to remove a charm or fear effect once per turn at the cost of your action. And then finally, for the base class, we come to Purity of Body at level 10, which makes you immune to poison and disease. So monks have a lot going on, and most of that has been retained for their base class mechanics in Baldur's Gate 3. Where things get particularly interesting, however, is the subclasses, because that is where they made significant changes. Though technically speaking, they did keep the 3 subclasses from the player's handbook, which are the Way of the Open Palm, Way of the Shadow, and Way of the 4 Elements. We're going to start with Elements because that one's the most straightforward. Basically, with that subclass, we can pick up a variety of spells that cost key points to use. These are effectively just slightly renamed and imagined versions of elemental wizard spells. So if you want to add some magic to your highly mobile, unarmed build, then you might want to consider this one. The only real change they made here is that at level 9, we pick up an ability that is going to increase the damage on some of these abilities to keep them relevant once the damage starts to fall off. The other 2, Shadow and Open Palm, have seen more substantial changes. Way of the Open Hand, of course, goes all in on your unarmed strikes, right at level 3, allowing us to use our Flurry of Blows to also do things like push enemies away, stagger them, or potentially even knock them over. Then at level 6, they pick up Manifestations. This is not a thing in the tabletop, but Manifestations are passive toggles that you can change out to add either necrotic, psychic, or radiant damage to your unarmed strikes, making them deal a bit more damage with each hit. And then lastly, we have another addition, though technically this is a rework of an ability that comes later in their level ups, with Key Resonation. Key Resonation allows them to hit an enemy and then activate an ability that deals a big AoE explosion to everyone around, giving them some AoE damage that can be quite strong against groups of enemies. Again, this is normally something you would get later as a monk at I think it's level 17 off the top of my head, or at least a similar concept. And it looks like they added this reworked version because without it, the rest of the Open Hand subclass would have been really boring. That would have gotten basically nothing. And lastly, that brings us to Way of the Shadow. Now, if you, throughout this video, have been thinking to yourself, you could probably put all that dexterity we're using to use and become a thief or an assassin potentially. Well, that's what this subclass is for. Because dexterity is in fact great at making us good for stealth and lockpicking, and this subclass leans into that pretty heavily. Right as you pick this up at level 3, they can again pick up a few different spells at the cost of key points, but these are more focused on things revolving around stealth, like darkness, blind, etc., as opposed to the elemental damage from the 4 Elements subclass. And then from there, they make a pretty significant change right at level 5, where they give us Cloak of Shadows instead of giving it to us when we would have hit level 11. Cloak of Shadows is a pretty simple ability. It simply allows you to become invisible, which is naturally pretty useful for this playstyle, but again, you're going to get that at level 5 instead of level 11. And then at level 6, we have Shadow Step. This allows us to teleport while hidden to an area within 60 feet, while also granting us advantage on our next attack. At level 11, we get a similar ability called Shadow Strike, but this allows us to teleport while hidden and also hit an enemy at the same time for our unarmed damage plus some psychic damage, which makes the Shadow Monk a pretty solid choice for a thief or assassin style of character. Now that's pretty much everything to know about the monk from a class mechanic standpoint, and with all that covered, now's a good time to start talking about playing a monk, which, as you might have gathered over the course of this video, is somewhat straightforward, given all of their classes' focus on making unarmed strikes or attacking multiple times in melee, with only a couple of their subclasses giving us access to more ranged-oriented options. A monk will typically be up close and personal with enemies, making a variety of attacks, making them a pretty quick and agile fighter. And while you can build them to be relatively survivable, they tend to have less health than, say, a fighter or a paladin or something, which means while they can avoid getting hit pretty well, when they do get hit, they are a bit squishier than other more tankier classes. However, with their key powers giving them access to a variety of helpful spells potentially, or just other class abilities, they can mix up combat, especially melee-oriented combat, in fun ways that require you to think about how best to apply those to each individual situation. And that, combined with their extensive movement, can make them incredibly deadly when they start hitting you first. So when it comes to playing that sort of light and quick on their feet role, that's where monks really excel. So when it comes to multi-classing one, the no-brainer option there is monk and rogue. Monk has a lot of the same abilities that a rogue does, thanks to their shared reliance on dexterity, and Rogue's sneak attack option goes especially well with the Shadow Monk, provided, of course, you're actually using a weapon there. It's important to note that won't work with unarmed strikes, as sneak attack requires a weapon. But there's a lot of overlap between Monk and Rogue that can make playing a stealthy character a lot of fun. Another similar option here is Ranger. Ranger also uses dexterity and wisdom, and will give the Monk access to things like a fighting style, and depending on how far in you go, potentially an animal companion to boot. Though other fun options are a Monk and a Cleric, as Clerics also make use of a high wisdom score, and many of the spells that a Cleric would get access to make a good amount of sense for a Monk to have, especially combined with some of the Cleric domains that we have access to, such as Tempest, which is a somewhat similar situation to Monk and Druid. All in all, though, Monks are a really interesting class with a pretty unique class fantasy that can make role-playing one pretty unique in and of itself, while at the same time, thanks to some of the very, I would say, prudent changes that Larian has made to the Monk to make them more interesting in this game, provides them with an opportunity to shine that can make them an interesting choice for people who might not have considered playing them otherwise, because the time I spent with it was pretty enjoyable, and I'm, truth be told here at the end of this video, not a huge fan of the class. But even I have to admit they did some really cool things in tweaking this to make it viable. With that in mind, though, that's pretty much everything I've got for this overview video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time continuing our Baldur's Gate 3 class overview series with the Paladin. Often seen as a righteous crusader, both heavily armed and proficient in melee to say the least, or a protector of the downtrodden and the weak. But the thing about Beacons of Light is that they inherently cast shadows, which is where the opportunity for potentially more sinister underpinnings come into play. That said, while this video will be focusing on the class fantasy of a Paladin, some of the things you can do with it, alongside the class mechanics, specifically how they relate to Baldur's Gate 3, it's important to mention that they have made some changes from the source material here that in some ways limit the role-playing a little bit, because the role-playing involved with a Paladin is fairly substantial, especially with the TTRPG. So understand a lot of this isn't a one-for-one translation. In some ways I think that is better, and other ways somewhat worse, to be honest. I want to kick this video off like the others with the class fantasy of a Paladin. Now, historically, Paladins have been on the side of righteousness and were required to be lawful good as part of being a Paladin. You see this a lot in earlier editions of D&D, where there is a literal alignment associated with the Paladin class, which is lawful good. However, 5th edition D&D in particular worked to move away from the alignment system, alongside even complete devotion to a deity here. And while a lot of that still exists, which we'll talk about in just a second, I think it's important when you're talking about a Paladin in 5th edition D&D to understand that for the sake of capturing the nuance of what a Paladin is or can be, a fair amount of that has been stripped away, so to speak. It is very possible, albeit rare, for a Paladin to be very much so evil. With that in mind, let's talk about the overview of it here. Very much so, Paladins are, at least the vast majority of them, defenders of the weak and beacons of holy righteousness who attempt to mete out justice to sinners and fight evil wherever it may be. Typically speaking, this power is granted by a deity, and depending upon the oath they swear, the exact nature of their service and the morality of it can differ quite a bit. But again, for the most part, this is a class that pushes you towards being righteous and everything that goes along with that, while at the same time being heavily armored and dealing quite a bit of damage, which plays pretty well into that standard holy warrior archetype. But being a Paladin is more than that. Their dedication to their oath is very much so an almost holy act, and it is in keeping with the tenets of said oath that they gain their power and can manifest the divine powers granted to them. So simply being a warrior who believes in a deity in the Forgotten Realms isn't enough to truly be a paladin. However, much of that is relevant to both lawful good or potentially much more evil characters. Now, depending on the oath you swear is what is going to change a lot of it, and this is where I think the roleplay of Baldur's Gate 3 can actually be a little more limiting than the tabletop, because with the tabletop versions, you're able to adjust, say, like an Oath of Devotion to be more tailored towards something a bit more sinister or an evil paladin just right out of the gate. That's not really an option in a video game, which will lead into how we become a sort of evil paladin in Baldur's Gate 3. But at the base of it, a paladin is a warrior for a deity that follows a strict code of conduct known as a sacred oath. The deity you serve and how important that is to you is largely up to you for role-playing purposes. Even in Baldur's Gate 3, we don't actually pick a deity, and I'm not sure if that will be added on launch or not. So most of that is going to be roleplay, but your ability to keep up with the oaths and actually uphold them is important. So with that in mind, let's start talking a bit how this works mechanically in Baldur's Gate 3. First up, we're going to be talking about our general information, just as a paladin in general, what you need to know in terms of stats and armor proficiency. Our primary stats are going to be strength, followed very closely by charisma, though depending on if you multi-class, you do have a little bit of leeway here, but in very general terms, strength and charisma are what are most important. And then proficiency-wise, we are proficient with all armor, light, medium, and heavy, on top of shields and simple and martial weapons. So we'll be able to use most all equipment right out of the gate as a paladin, which is why most of them are heavily armored. But now let's actually talk about these sacred oaths. Ultimately, there will be 4 in Baldur's Gate 3. 3 of them are in early access, and 1 will be added later with the actual launch. These are the Oath of Devotion, Ancients, Vengeance, or the last one, Oathbreaker, which is to say you didn't uphold your oath, which means your power with that oath was taken from you and replaced with something else. While I won't go over every single power available to every single oath, as the roleplay I think in this instance is more important, the oaths can be divided into a few important things. 1, the tenets that is required to uphold them. An Oath of Devotion paladin, for instance, is bound to uphold the ideals of justice, virtue, and simply order. So doing things that would go against that would strip you of your oath. The Oath of the Ancients is more about mercy and being a beacon of hope to the desperate, as an example, which is a subtle difference, but still important. But then we have things like the Oath of Vengeance, which are more about swearing to take vengeance upon those who have committed especially grievous sins. This particular oath is less about protecting the weak and upholding righteousness as it is punishing wrongdoers. Beyond just the tenets, however, these oaths will grant us individual powers as they are effectively our subclasses. For starters, each oath will grant you a small list of extra spells, as paladins are half casters. However, each oath also gives us the ability to channel our oath. In the tabletop version, this is known as Channel Divinity, and in Baldur's Gate 3, it is known as Channeling Oath. This will give you a variety of powers, and this is probably a good time to mention that Baldur's Gate 3 has a pretty big variance in how you choose an oath when you level up here versus the tabletop version. In Baldur's Gate 3, you pick a subclass right at level 1, or at least an oath to uphold, which will give you a couple of small features right out of the gate. In the tabletop version, you actually don't pick your subclass until level 3 as a paladin. So many of our abilities that come with channeling our oath, we still don't get until level 3, even though we pick the oath right at level 1 and get some small powers to go with it that are separate. Channeling our oath usually gives us one of a couple different options that, at the cost of some action type or another, will grant you some unique effect, which will vary by oath. For instance, the Oath of Vengeance can channel divinity to gain advantage on attack rolls against a target for 1 minute or until it drops, whereas the Oath of the Ancients can potentially allow you to channel nature to restrain enemies with vines, various little things like that. And then at level 7, in addition to our normal class mechanics, each oath you take will provide you an aura of some sort. For the Oath of Devotion, this is the Aura of Devotion, which makes sure that allies within 10 feet of you can't be charmed as long as you're conscious. Whereas the Oath of the Ancients gives us resistance to damage from spells to you and everyone within 10 feet of you. Oath of Vengeance Vengeance, however, gives you something else for level 7 called Relentless Avenger, which lets you move a bit after making an opportunity attack. That said, now I want to talk about Oathbreaker very specifically, because in Baldur's Gate 3 it is absolutely possible to break your oath, and because we have to pick one of the oaths available to us right at the beginning, we're kind of immediately role-playing as a good paladin no matter how you spin it. And then you have to make the conscious decision if you want to be an evil paladin to do something that would break your oath, like say kill someone or steal or lie to someone, swear to protect them and then kill them, just generally evil things to do. It will vary a little bit by what oath you took specifically, but generally just be evil and you'll wind up breaking it. However, you have two options at this point. You can perform a penance of sorts by paying the Oathbreaker Knight who shows up when you break your oath, which will restore your oath and thus your powers, or you can let the Oathbreaker Knight remake you as an Oathbreaker Paladin, opening up our fourth subclass, which will grant you abilities and spells more befitting of someone who is no longer upholding their sacred oath, but rather having fallen to darkness. And while I think this is very cool, I do think it undercuts some of the potential role-playing of just immediately playing a paladin that is simply working for an evil deity, which isn't a big limitation, but it is there. From there, though, let's talk about the rest of the paladin's class mechanics, because really we're kind of just getting into it. Right out of the gate, a paladin will be able to use Divine Sense and Lay on Hands. Lay on Hands allows us to either heal someone or cure poison or disease at the cost of Lay on Hands charges. How many times you can do this and how effective it is will increase as you level up, but then we have Divine Sense. Divine Sense is actually reworked from the tabletop version. In the tabletop version, Divine Sense is simply the ability to detect celestial or fiendish creatures and know exactly what type of fiend or angel it is. You can also even detect places that have been consecrated or desecrated. However, in Baldur's Gate 3, what this actually allows you to do is gain advantage on your attack rolls against celestials, fiends, or undead, which simply makes them easier to hit. So a bit different there, though arguably more useful in a video game. Now at second level, paladins also get to pick one of 4 fighting styles, either defense, dueling, great weapon fighting, or protection. These are going to let you specialize in a type of fighting and also gain benefits for doing so. Defense simply gives you a +1 to AC. Dueling gives you a +2 to damage rolls if you're using a one-handed weapon and nothing in your offhand. Great weapon fighting will actually re-roll any 1 or 2 damage dice you roll with a two-handed weapon equipped, though just once, so if you roll a 1 twice in a row, it still sucks. And then there is protection. If you are wielding a shield and an ally nearby is attacked, you can force the enemy to take disadvantage on the roll against that enemy. But we're not done yet with second level, because second level is also when paladins gain access to the first bit of their spellcasting. For the most part, paladins are very similar to a cleric in terms of spellcasting. They gain all their spells at once. They simply have to prepare the ones that they want to use for the day. So they are prepared casters. However, we will only get up to 5th level spells with a paladin at a maximum, and specifically with Baldur's Gate 3's level 12 cap, we're only going to get up to 3rd level spells. However, while the spellcasting is useful in many circumstances, sure, what you're more likely to be using those spell slots for is Divine Smite. At 2nd level as well, when they gain their spellcasting, paladins can, when they hit a creature with a melee weapon attack, expend one of their spell slots to deal radiant damage to that target in addition to the regular hit. This is 2d8 initially, but as you start learning higher spell slots, you can expend higher level spell slots, like a 2nd or 3rd level one, to increase that damage by another d8, though this does max out at 5d8. However, you get another 1d8 if the target is undead or a fiend. Now in Baldur's Gate 3 specifically, you can set up your reaction window to prompt exactly how you would like to deal with this, and you can either set it up to ask you very specifically, or you can choose a paladin icon that can be added to your hotbar that will let you just activate Divine Smite as an attack without you having to worry about the game asking you or anything. So you can either activate it as an ability when you attack, or simply let the reaction do its thing as well. Then at 5th level, paladins will gain the extra attack that pretty much every martial class gets at 5th level. Then at 6th level, we pick up Aura of of Protection, which will allow ourselves and nearby allies to add the Paladin's Charisma modifier as a bonus to any saving throws provided the Paladin is conscious. Then at 10th level, they pick up Aura of Courage, which makes you and friendly creatures nearby immune to fear effects or becoming frightened. Then at 11th level, we pick up Improved Divine Smite. This adds 1d8 radiant damage as a baseline to your melee attacks. You don't have to activate Divine Smite anymore to get that baseline effect. If you choose to activate Divine Smite as well, though, it's in addition to that regular damage. So at this point, all of your attacks will at least be doing an extra 1d8 radiant damage. Now with the level cap of 12, that is pretty much everything to expect from a Paladin mechanically, which brings us to how playing a Paladin actually feels. Now overall, I would say the heavily armored, melee-oriented Paladin is very much so the way to go. Almost all of their mechanics specifically revolve around melee combat. For instance, Divine Smite technically doesn't work if you're using a bow, as it has to be a melee hit. And that, combined with all of their defensive abilities, such as all of their auras that can protect nearby allies, they are ideally suited for either front row DPS or a tank. Either or really can work, as they can deal incredible damage. Just with Divine Smite and a two-handed weapon, if you get a lucky crit, you can hit for like 50 damage at level 2, which is huge. So their damage potential is very much so there, but because of all their defensive abilities and support, they can also play the role of a party tank. And combined with their spell casting, they even have a little bit of support potential thrown in there. And just that stuff is really what makes Paladin such a popular class, even outside of their class fantasy, because mechanically they are a very strong class that can do a lot of things. Basically, as long as you're not trying to hit something with a bow, you're pretty much golden. And then a lot of the nuance to playing them comes down to knowing when it is better to do things like hit with Divine Smite or cast a spell to aid your allies. And it's a bit of a balancing act of those two things typically, and how well you manage to juggle being either damage, a tank, or potentially a little bit of support is what's going to make the biggest difference when it comes to actually playing as a Paladin in combat. But with Paladins, there also comes the role-playing aspect of playing a Paladin, which is down to how you treat and talk to people, because as I mentioned, it is very possible to break your oath, and if that's not something you want to do, you need to make sure you are picking dialogue options and taking actions that actually represent the oath you swore to uphold. That very much so matters for a Paladin, because otherwise, if you don't want to become an oath breaker, you're going to constantly be paying gold to restore your oath. So just as a class, they have a roleplay element sort of baked into what they're doing mechanically. And then naturally, I want to leave off with a bit of multi-class options, as I like to mention these at the end of the videos. Paladins, as a heavily armored charisma-based class, can be very useful as a multi-class for a few other classes. So some popular ones here are, to start with, the Sorcerer is one of the best combinations in D&D in my opinion, and it allows you to either turn your spellcaster into a much tankier version with just a couple levels of Paladin, or with just a couple levels of Sorcerer and going all in on Paladin, you can make use of the Sorcerer's meta magic to alter a Paladin spells. Could also be pretty useful depending on exactly how some of that pans out in the release version, but Sorcerer is a very strong multi-class and there's a few different ways you can play it. Another option is mixing Paladin with Warlock, which might seem a little awkward at first, but ultimately they both use Charisma. With the Hexblade Warlock being absent from Baldur's Gate 3, they are retooling a few of the Warlock's abilities, one of which is causing Pact of the Blade as a Warlock to use your Charisma modifier on your attack rolls. This will allow a Paladin to use Charisma for their attack rolls and everything, and then coupled with Divine Smite and some of the other Warlock abilities, like using their spell slots to fuel Divine Smite, for instance, could be a very strong way to go. Or on the other side of that, if you just take 2 levels of Paladin and go all in on Warlock, you'll be giving your Warlock Divine Sense, Fighting Styles, Lay on Hands, not to mention Divine Smite, which in combination with a Warlock's abilities could be really strong as well. So another great option. And those are certainly the ones you'll probably see the most often, but even then you could still mix this with other martial classes, like say a fighter, to get access to Action Surge, which will let you Divine Smite twice potentially. So you have a few different options in terms of multi-classing, but overall, to sort of wrap this video up, the Paladin is such an interesting class from a roleplay perspective, then combined with really strong mechanics, which can make it one of the more interesting classes to play if you're willing to do some of the headcanon around how this is going to work. And while I do think their implementation in Baldur's Gate does limit the roleplay a little bit just because of how things work there mechanically in a video game, especially in regards to the oaths and how they get broken and things like that, it can be a bit awkward to roleplay certain things, but I still think it's a really great class to play because combining it with something like the Dark Urge origin, which we'll see our main character being given violent urges they have to fight, combined with having to uphold a Paladin's oath, could be a really interesting take and way to roleplay a class. And ultimately, because of that, Paladins can be righteous warriors, dark avengers, hell knights, and many things in between. Because what defines a Paladin and their own perspective on the oaths they are sworn to uphold is really down to you, the player. That, I think, is the most interesting part about them. With that, however, we are going to wrap this particular video up. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. The channel just hit 200,000 subscribers, which means the world to me, and I can't say thank you enough. So thank you, may you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you another class overview for Baldur's Gate 3 with the Rogue, a class often known for its skill and precision both on and off the battlefield. And with that in mind, what we're covering here is mostly class fantasy, class mechanics, things like that. We're not getting too deep into the math of these things, mostly just what to expect from playing one. And on that note, with Baldur's Gate 3 in particular, there have been some significant changes here and there to the Rogue class to make them more applicable to a video game. And while much of it transfers straight from the tabletop version, there have been a few things altered to fit the game. So something to keep in mind as we move through this for sure. The first thing I want to talk about here is the class fantasy of a rogue, because it is as simple or as complicated as you want it to be. Especially since when thinking of a rogue, you likely already have an idea of what that is in your head, and in many ways you would absolutely be correct about that. Whether they be outlaws, hardened criminals, thieves, assassins, a rogue can be and encompass many different walks of life, sides of the law even. Many of them aren't necessarily doing anything illegal, even if they are still associated with shady individuals. Where a fighter will focus on martial excellence in combat, rogues often spend just as much effort mastering the use of skills outside of combat, which is why they're especially adept at picking locks, perhaps as their most notable thing. That said, they can also be incredibly effective assassins or thieves by utilizing stealth, which often requires knowledge of disarming traps or even being a really adept climber. A rogue will be focusing on learning as much as possible about the skills necessary to plunder a dungeon or steal from a mansion. And because of that, on the non-combat side of things in particular, you really have a lot of options for roleplay in terms of a rogue, such as where you got those skills from. And we'll double back to that, because on the combat side of things, rogues are known for deadly efficiency. Specifically, they like to exploit enemies' weaknesses, which takes the form of their unique class mechanic, Sneak Attack. And when you put all that together, rogues are typically light on their feet while using their agility to, again, exploit enemy weakness. But when it comes to creating a rogue or playing as one and what you want to roleplay there, it's important to note that while many rogues are very much so associated with criminal dealings, they certainly don't have to be. There are very much so legal ways for a rogue to ply their trade or simply apply their knowledge for what they are good at. This could take the form of simply being a locksmith, investigating things as a private detective, or perhaps even as an exterminator. They might even simply have trained to be a rogue specifically to be a treasure hunter and go adventuring. So because of that, especially on the roleplay side of things, when it comes to playing a rogue, you might want to consider what your relationship to the law actually is. Were you perhaps working for some sort of thieves guild? Were you an assassin for hire? Or maybe the beginnings of a hard life caused you to pick up skills simply to survive. All of which are valid answers for a rogue, which can make them particularly interesting to play. From there though, let's move on to some of our class mechanics, starting with our general info. As a class, rogues focus primarily on dexterity. They're typically going to be using finesse weapons to make use of that dexterity even in combat, but dexterity is often used as the basis for many of their skills as well, such as stealth or picking locks. After dexterity, though, you kind of have a lot of wiggle room here. Depending on the subclass you pick up, which may or may not include a little bit of magic, you might want to grab some intelligence to help you out there. Charisma can be especially useful if you pick up skills devoted to sort of lying and charming your way through situations, which is also very much so on brand for a rogue, but your primary ability score is dexterity. In terms of proficiencies, however, we are going to be proficient with light armor, simple weapons, hand crossbows, long swords, rapiers, and short swords. However, when talking about proficiencies when it comes to a rogue, it's also a good idea to mention the skills, just like with the bard, because rogues are known for being very skilled in many things. As such, as a class, they get to pick 4 skills right at character creation in addition to any they have picked up via their background or their race. And right away at level 1, you'll get to take expertise in 2 of these, which will double the bonus for that skill. It's very possible to have a rogue right at level 1 that gets like a +7 to something like stealth or picking a lock, which is a great representation of their initial training. So if you want someone who can perform a variety of tasks and pass a lot of ability checks, rogues are a great way to go in addition to the bard. But now let's talk about a few of our class mechanics. Also starting at level 1, and perhaps the defining feature of a rogue really is their sneak attack. And in 5th edition D&D and Baldur's Gate, where a game can be exploited, sneak attack's going to be a big deal. Essentially, what this allows us to do is hit an enemy's weak spot for an extra 1d6 damage at level 1, though this will increase as you level up, to the level cap of Baldur's Gate 3 with a maximum of 6d6, so a potential extra 36 damage. However, in order to make this attack, there are a few prerequisites. You have to have advantage on the attack roll. There's a variety of ways to gain advantage, but in lieu of not being able to get advantage specifically, which is simply an increased chance to hit the target, it's also possible to sneak attack if there is another ally within 5 feet of the enemy, which represents flanking them. Now, in Baldur's Gate 3 in particular, it's worth a mention that this is not passive damage added if the requirements are met, but rather this is a separate rogue ability that you have to activate that will add the sneak attack damage onto the attack. But in the right circumstances, this makes rogues incredibly deadly, because if they hit an enemy while they are not seen, thus granting them advantage, they'll get a significant boost to the attack. Or if you're simply flanking an enemy and they're distracted, you have that potential as well. And this is what makes rogues great damage dealers under certain conditions that you can maximize to really lean into the class fantasy. That said, it's not the only thing we get. Starting at 2nd level, we get Cunning Action. This allows us in Baldur's Gate 3 to take the dash or disengage action as a bonus action instead of a full action. This effectively means we can run twice as far as we would normally be able to and then still take our action at the end of it, which would normally be a whole turn for another class. And when combined with one of the subclasses we'll talk about, this can be especially useful, but you'll get Cunning Action as a base level 2 rogue regardless. From there, at 5th level, we would pick up Uncanny Dodge, which allows you, when attacked by an enemy that you can see, you'll get to use your reaction potentially to half the damage against you, which is a nice defensive option that would replace an extra attack that you might normally get as a martial character. At 7th level, they pick up Evasion, which allows them to make dexterity saving throws to take 0 damage instead of the normal half when attacked by things that are AoE in nature. So like a wizard's spell, you'd normally make a dexterity save to half that damage, but if a rogue with evasion makes that save, they take 0 damage, and if they fail it, they take half damage, thus reducing the damage from AoEs. And then at level 11, you pick up Reliable Talent, which would allow you to, on any skill roll that you are proficient in that you roll below a 10, you could take a 10 instead. And for Baldur's Gate 3, those are the important ones to know, as the level cap is 12 and everything else comes beyond that. The rest of their class features and mechanics are going to come from their subclasses in particular. We're going to get 3 of these in the launch version of the game, which are the Arcane Trickster, the Thief, and the Assassin. 2 of these are in early access, Arcane Trickster and Thief, with Assassin being added on launch. Now, the one I want to start with is actually Thief, because I think they've made some really interesting changes here. Thief in the tabletop is very much so focused on sneaking and a lot of extra mobility to enable that sneaking. However, they've made some specific changes in Baldur's Gate 3 that make it potentially incredibly combat effective. Primarily with their starting Fast Hands ability. Right at level 3 when you pick a subclass, Fast Hands is going to give you an additional bonus action. In the tabletop version, this lets you use your Cunning action to take any dexterity check rather than just the dash or disengage options, such as allowing you to disarm a trap, open a lock, etc. But in a video game that wouldn't be super useful, so they changed it to just give you an extra bonus action, which might not sound like much, but this is effectively going to allow you to take a Cunning action to dash and move twice as far, while also getting a full main hand attack and an offhand attack if you were to say dual wield. And in potential combination with other abilities to give you more attacks, that could be particularly useful. They also made a change to second story work. In the tabletop version, this is supposed to allow you to climb faster than normal effectively without it costing you extra movement. And if you were to run and jump, you could add more feet to that jump based on your dexterity modifier. But here they've simply caused it to give you resistance to falling damage instead, which again is a little more directly impactful in a video game. And honestly, jump is already incredibly powerful, so it really didn't need the extra buff. That's mostly what you can expect from Thief in Baldur's Gate 3, and if you're picking this subclass, it's really going to come down to how impactful you manage to make the Fast Hands change. The other one in early access, however, is Arcane Trickster. This is another 1/3 caster that allows us to augment our rogue abilities with some small amounts of wizard magic. Because this is wizard magic, all of this magic is going to use our intelligence ability score, but this allows us to do some fun things. Specific to an Arcane Trickster rogue, however, is their Mage Hand. You'll get Mage Hand as a free cantrip for taking this archetype. However, in addition to what Mage Hand can normally do, an Arcane Trickster's Mage Hand is going to be invisible and also be able to perform extra actions, such as picking a lock or disarming a trap, which effectively means you can do those things at range, which adds a lot of versatility on the potentially non-combat side of things. However, specifically in combat, some of these spells that you'll be able to get will be particularly useful to a rogue. Mostly, these are going to focus on the illusion and enchantment skills and maybe a little bit of divination. But while what's available to you is relatively small, they are very useful, such as picking up the True Strike cantrip, which is going to grant you advantage on an attack, which could mean very specifically setting up your sneak attacks that way. You could also pick up things like Sleep to knock enemies out, again to aid the non-combat side of things, along with spells like Color Spray or Disguise Self, etc. Just a lot of stuff to facilitate being a rogue. So while you won't get any particularly devastating spells, as at the level cap of 12 in Baldur's Gate 3, this is going to give you access to level 2 spells. If you use them in creative ways, you can get a lot out of an Arcane Trickster. And if you take this all the way to level 9, when you are hidden from a creature and cast a spell on it, they'll actually have disadvantage on any saving throw against it, which can help you make sure the spell actually hits or has its intended effect. That does bring us to our last subclass with Assassin, however. Now, if Thief or Arcane Trickster aren't your thing and you just want to go purely combat, then Assassin is really the way to go, as this one focuses primarily on damage. Now, right at level 3, when you pick up this archetype, you gain the Assassinate class feature, which actually does two things for us, and both are very strong. For starters, we gain advantage on any enemy that hasn't taken a turn in combat yet, which gives us the potential to make use of our sneak attack much more than we might get to normally. However, the other half of this is that if we hit any creature that is surprised, say from stealth or a simple surprise round, that attack is automatically a critical hit. And that guaranteed critical combined with our sneak attack damage can make for some devastating blows to enter combat with. And this is why you'll often see people mention multi-classing this with a Gloomstalker Ranger, which also has abilities that focus on dealing more damage right as you enter combat. So these make a particularly deadly combo. In addition to that though, as an assassin, you're also supposed to, at level 9, get an ability called Infiltration Expertise, which in the tabletop version is supposed to allow you to make effectively false identities for yourself to more easily infiltrate places and make your assassinations. However, I imagine that will be reworked in the launch version of Baldur's Gate 3, as mechanically it doesn't quite work in a video game. so they might simply give you like Disguise Self or something as an ability there. But the main thing is the Assassinate and what it can do for you in combat. And that brings us to playing a rogue. If you couldn't get the gist from everything I've mentioned here, rogues as a character come down to a lot of non-combat utility, such as sneaking into places, picking locks, or in a dungeon environment simply being incredibly agile, which is going to allow them to get around gaps or climb up things that other people might not be able to, which might have its own utility. So when it comes to playing a rogue, do keep in mind that some of their skill set isn't necessarily directly translated right to the battlefield. But when it comes to the battlefield in particular, that is to say combat, playing a rogue really comes down to maximizing your sneak attack, be that attacking enemies from stealth or hitting when you have advantage in particular, or simply making sure you position your allies correctly so you can make use of the flanking requirement to make your sneak attacks, while also taking advantage of the significant amount of mobility that the class has via their cunning action. So in combat, that mostly amounts to setting up the hits you want to make and then appropriately sneak attacking. However, things do get a little more interesting when you talk about multi-classing a rogue, because there's some interesting things you can do there. I already mentioned the infamous Assassin Gloomstalker rogue, and while it certainly might not be the most original of choices, it is very effective, because Assassin and Gloomstalker Ranger will allow you to set up an incredibly deadly first turn and cripple an enemy before the fight even starts. However, a personal favorite of mine, just because it's kind of silly, is to multi-class them with a Barbarian. And in Baldur's Gate 3, where we already know they're removing the attribute requirements for multi-classing, this might potentially be even better, because Barbarians have a lot of ways to gain advantage on their melee attacks, which means with a rogue mixed in, they can potentially add sneak attacks to their melee, which is a novel approach, even if it might, at first glance, not make a lot of sense to have a Barbarian and a rogue multi-class together. And then, as always, another simple option is to simply mix them with Fighter for the added survivability, potentially the fighting style and action surge that Fighter will give you can all make a rogue that much more deadly. So as you can see, there's a lot of ways to play a rogue, but they have a lot of strengths, many of them not necessarily even to do with combat in particular. And getting the most out of the rogue really requires you to lean into all of those things. So whether they be a hardened criminal or a simple locksmith trying to make a living, or someone trained particularly to delve a few dungeons in search of treasure, rogues make up a wide variety of characters and abilities, which is what makes them so fun to play. That said, that is going to be everything for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned a few things. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a class overview for the Ranger in Baldur's Gate 3 ahead of the game's official launch, where we'll be talking about the class fantasy of a Ranger on top of some of its many class mechanics available in Baldur's Gate 3. And while we've done several of these so far, some of them are pretty good guides for 5th edition D&D as a whole, but in the case of the Ranger in particular, Larian has made some significant changes to their class mechanics in order for them to feel up to par in Baldur's Gate 3. Because if you're unaware, Rangers in 5th edition D&D, while I wouldn't outright say they're bad or anything, they have a lot of class mechanics that are very situational. For instance, in the tabletop version of the game, they have an ability called Favored Enemy that allows them to get advantage on tracking certain enemies, and while that can be useful in certain situations, if you're not playing a module where you need to track something, that doesn't do you any good. And that's just one of many examples. So as we go through this and talk about Rangers, do understand that significant changes have been made to them in Baldur's Gate 3, and that's what we're going to be talking about specifically. That said, I like to kick these videos off talking a bit about the class fantasy of said class, and Rangers are an interesting case because, in a somewhat similar sense to Paladins, in the early editions of the game, Rangers were required to be of a good alignment. Unlike Paladins, they had a little bit of wiggle room there. They could be lawful good or chaotic good, but they had to be good. This was a requirement that was dropped all the way back in, I believe it was 3rd edition. as nothing about a ranger really necessitates them to be good. But the reason that alignment restriction ever existed in the first place is that as a class fantasy, rangers are meant to be defenders of civilization, but on the fringes of society. They are wardens of forests. They are protectors of isolated villages, that kind of thing. They are very much so a sort of predator working their way through the untamed wilds of the world, working and living in places other people would find incredibly difficult to do so. This has seen them pick up a variety of combat methods that allow them to both commune with nature but also be very self-reliant. They are a fiercely independent type of person, and while they have been known to work with gatherings of druids, among others, when a need arises, generally these are people that are loners and left to their own devices. As such, they are skilled hunters, they are used to living off the land, and in case you are wondering, it is not a coincidence that they might remind you of Aragorn from Lord of the Rings, because some of their original versions of the Ranger were very much so based on Lord of the Rings and specifically the character Aragorn. By the time Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rolled around, the second edition that is, they started incorporating other inspirations such as Robin Hood, for instance. But however you want to look at it, Rangers are incredibly skilled outdoorsmen who have learned to commune with nature to cast a limited selection of spells, which is one of many tools at their arsenal that makes them deadly hunters. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about some general information for Rangers, such as their proficiencies and primary ability scores. Now, ability score wise, Rangers typically rely off of dexterity and wisdom. It is possible to make a strength-based ranger, though typically that's not very common, especially if you're actually putting levels into ranger. Primarily because they used ranged weapons such as bows a lot, which use dexterity, and then they often use finesse weapons, which attack rolls use dexterity. So while strength is possible, it is unusual. And then they need wisdom for their casting stat, as rangers are in fact half casters, and their magic comes from a very similar place as druids, so they use wisdom as well. Proficiency-wise, right out of the gate, they are proficient with light and medium armor, as well as simple and martial weapons. Next, I want to talk a little bit about their spellcasting ability. As I mentioned, they are half casters and they use wisdom as their casting stat, but more specifically, a lot of their spells revolve around either buffing or augmenting their ranged or potentially melee attacks with things such as Hunter's Mark, which causes extra damage when you hit an enemy, and if that enemy dies, you can recast Hunter's Mark, and it just gives you a little bit of extra damage. They also have a spell called Ensnaring Strike, which can ensnare enemies you hit with attacks, potentially. So a decent amount of a ranger's spell list goes into augmenting their attacks in some way. However, they also have other spells centered around restoration, or potentially things like speaking with animals or communing with nature in some way. So it's important to understand that while a ranger is in fact a half caster, a lot of their spells are important to, in essence, getting the most out of using them as a character, because if you're not applying something like Hunter's Mark when you're in combat, you're going to have a bad time. And the nice thing about Hunter's Mark is that if you kill an enemy with it, you can freely recast it without using up spell slots. So if you're not doing that, you're actively hurting your experience and you're going to kill your damage a little bit. Basically meaning that they have a lot of spells that they need to utilize to get the most out of the character. Now from there, we're going to talk a little bit about the class mechanics, and this is initially where there were a lot of changes made. So in Baldur's Gate 3, we will be picking a favored enemy. However, in the tabletop version, all favored enemy does is give you a bonus, so to speak, on wisdom survival checks to track enemies, as well as give you languages your favorite enemy might speak. And in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, that's just not going to be useful. So they changed that pretty much entirely, a complete rework. We have these 5 options you can see on screen here. Each of them will give you a proficiency in a skill now, while also providing some other sort of benefit. For instance, Bounty Hunter will cause enemies you hit with Ensnaring Strike to have disadvantage on their saving throws. Or you could pick something like Ranger Knight, which will actually give you proficiency in history, but also give you heavy armor proficiency right out of the gate. And this, just right off the bat, gives a pretty big boon to rangers that can be useful in a variety of situations, and they continue this trend with Natural Explorer, which has also seen significant reworks. Natural Explorer in the tabletop version allows you to pick a favored terrain, which would give you a variety of bonuses to mostly just traveling in the TTRPG, which again isn't super useful in a game like Baldur's Gate 3. So they reworked this as well to either provide resistances to certain elements or granting us sleight of hand proficiency, with another option giving us the ability to use Find Familiar at will, though if you're going Beastmaster, I don't imagine that would be super useful for you. Nonetheless though, some nice benefits to what would otherwise be something useless in a game like this. While we're talking about large changes though, something else they seem to have done is gotten rid of Primeval Awareness altogether. At 3rd level in the TTRPG, Rangers would be able to use Primeval Awareness to spend a turn and a Ranger spell slot to sense if certain types of enemies were present in the surrounding area, which would gain bonuses if you were in your favored terrain. Again, this just isn't something useful in Baldur's Gate 3, and it looks like they cut this one all together. I couldn't find it anywhere. And given there are already significant changes to Favored Enemy and Natural Explorer, that's not a huge surprise to me. But moving on from there, at 2nd level, Rangers get to pick up a fighting style, though it has to either be archery, defense, dueling, or 2-weapon fighting, meaning that a lot of their fighting styles again lean into more dex-based combat primarily, but either way you'll get to pick one of those fighting styles, which will confer a small bonus to you in regards to those things, so naturally pick the one you want to specialize in. And then at 5th level, like most other martial classes, they will get an extra attack at level 5, allowing them to attack twice instead of once in a single turn. Now, past that, there are a few more abilities that a ranger would get up to the level cap of Baldur's Gate 3, which will be level 12 for the full game. I'm going to go over them, but do understand, because of the significant changes the ranger has already seen, these might not be implemented in exactly this way. I think it's actually pretty likely in some cases. But at 8th level, we can pick up Land's Stride. This basically means we can move through difficult terrain without it actually being difficult terrain, which includes moving through non-magical plants that would otherwise hurt you or something and not being hurt by them. This also gives us advantage on saving throws against plants that are magically created, such as Entangling Vines from the Entangle spell. And then at 10th level, they pick up Hide in Plain Sight, which allows them to spend an action to effectively blend into their surroundings, which gives them a large bonus to stealth checks. I would assume these two will likely make it into the game with some sort of variation, but up to the level cap of 12, that's all the mechanics you need to worry about. Which brings us to the Ranger's subclasses. There will ultimately be 3 of these: Hunter, Beastmaster, as well as Gloomstalker. 2 of these are in the game right now in early access, Hunter and Beastmaster, and then Gloomstalker will be added at launch. Now when it comes to Ranger subclasses, 5th edition D&D likes to add a little bit of flair to essentially every type of subclass to give them a little bit of lore significance. In the case of the Ranger, their archetypes are based off of ideals that they follow. So a hunter is typically seen as having accepted their role as protectors of the fringes of civilization, whereas the Beastmaster embodies the friendship between man and animal and takes on an animal companion to represent that. But to start with the hunter, this is a subclass that focuses on your martial prowess. Right away, you'll be able to pick one of several abilities that will give you an advantage in combat, typically allowing you to make some sort of extra attack or deal more damage. With this really being exemplified by the Hunter's level 11 ability, Multi-Attack, which allows you to make a ranged attack against any number of creatures within 10 foot of a point you can see, or Whirlwind Attack, which allows you to make a melee attack against any enemy within 5 feet of you, with you getting as many attacks as there are enemies. So that one is much more about dealing as much damage to as many enemies as possible. But then we have Beastmaster. This one's pretty self-explanatory. You get an animal companion companion to join you in combat. As you level up with this subclass, the animal companion is capable of doing more and more for you, including doing things like getting extra attacks itself. You can pick from one of a few different animal companions, each with their own main ability that they can do, and it's a relatively simple system here in early access, so this might see some expansion, but as it stands, it's a nice touch. That leaves us with our last one though, which is Gloomstalker. Gloomstalker, while not in the early access period, is a sort of stealth and ambush focused ranger. They get a few extra spells such as Disguise Self or potentially Fear, and then right away when you take that subclass, you get bonuses to your initiative based off your wisdom modifier. On the first turn of combat, you have faster movement speed, and then if you attack on that first turn, you can actually make an additional weapon attack that specific turn as well, and if that attack hits, you deal more damage, again kind of symbolizing that ambush mechanic. They also get a unique ability that makes them immune to any creature trying to see them with dark vision. That is to say, if they are in darkness and the only way a creature could normally see them is with dark vision, then that creature just can't see them. And then later on, they get to basically re-roll an attack if they miss. So once on every one of their turns, they'll get the opportunity to make another attack if they miss with an attack, giving them more chances to deal more damage. So as you can see, Gloomstalker is more about a sort of stealthy approach to combat and dealing even more damage, especially right at the start of combat, to symbolize an ambush. So when it comes to actually playing a ranger, as you've probably picked up on, they're good at a few things in particular. For starters, they make very, very good archers, which should come as no surprise really, but between the spells that will add damage to their ranged attacks on top of the archery fighting style, they can get some really good damage as an archer. It's also possible to turn them into a dex-based fighter very, very easily if that's what you want to do, which means that Rangers can play a very solid role in your DPS lineup, especially ranged martial DPS or just being an archer. There's only a couple of classes that really excel at that, with the ranger being one of them. And then you add in their ability to do something like get an animal companion, which can help you turn the action economy in your favor by simply giving you more turns, and their utility-focused spell casting, which might help you out when it comes to healing here and there, can potentially be very useful as well. Now, generally speaking, especially in the tabletop version of D&D, the problem with Rangers is that they tend to just be a very situational class to play, and that may or may not wind up being the case in Baldur's Gate 3, as we simply don't have access to the full game yet, but once we do, we'll know for sure exactly how that winds up playing out. But it's a class that comes with a pretty rigid play style, and how big of an impact some of Larian's changes to the class here wind up having will ultimately remain to be seen. But the good news is, if you want to play an archer that has an animal companion with them, Baldur's Gate 3 has done a good job of getting a ranger up to speed in that regard. With that in mind, let's talk about a couple of multi-classing options as we move to wrap this video up. So there are two classes that are really common to multi-class a ranger with because they both use the same casting stat, which is Druid and Cleric. A Druid multi-class will allow you to potentially focus on shape-shifting into an animal while having an animal companion if you go Beastmaster. It's also a convenient way to get more spells. And then there is Cleric, specifically Nature Cleric, with their Channel Divinity ability allowing you to charm animals and plants. And then if you take Cleric all the way to level 6, you'll even get an ability that within 30 feet makes you resistant to elemental damage, potentially at the cost of a reaction, and combined with its very nature-based extra spell list, will thematically fit in with a ranger very well. Though a third option is actually to multi-class ranger with rogue. Sneak attack by being a rogue is quite good, simply because you can get sneak attacks when you attack with advantage, and then that combined with the cunning action will give you extra bonus actions, which as a class that uses spells with a lot of bonus actions, like Hunter's Mark for instance, this can be very useful. And then if you grab expertise, you can even make yourself incredibly good at a few specific skill checks, which can work incredibly well if you're trying to use stealth with, say, a Gloomstalker Ranger. So you have some options there with multi-class, and potentially it might actually make the base class itself of a Ranger even more compelling of an option when you mix it with some specific classes for certain things. But to wrap this video up and not go on too long, when it comes to the Ranger, what a lot of it really comes down to is how well some of these changes Larian have made ultimately wind up being. And with any luck, they're great, and the Ranger actually manages to keep up with the rest of the classes in terms of power, because while a Ranger might lack some of the many options other classes have, what they do provide is a really thematic way to play the game that can potentially offer you things such as an animal companion, or just some really solid damage in certain instances. So again, with any luck, the changes that they have made will be genuinely impactful on the rest of the game outside of early access, but that's something we'll have to wait and see on. But either way, it's a class with a strong identity and class fantasy, and that's something I'm a big fan of. That though is going to do it for this particular video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my class overview for the Sorcerer in Baldur's Gate 3. Continuing to go through the classes before launch, today we are talking about the Sorcerer. And while this will be a bit specific to Baldur's Gate 3, it will of course kind of serve as a guide for 5th edition D&D as well, simply because that is the system the game uses. But we're not going to be diving deep into the math of anything here, but more talking about the class fantasy on top of things like the general mechanics the class uses that make it unique. The math of these things, if you will, I will save for the relevant build videos. When it comes to talking about a sorcerer though, there's a few things that set them apart from other casting classes that we'll go over in this video that ultimately make them one of the more popular ways to play a spellcaster in 5th edition D&D, because a lot of their mechanics center around making the spellcasting as fun as possible, even if they are a little bit limited in what they can cast in comparison to, say, a wizard. But first and foremost, let's talk about the class fantasy of a sorcerer. What actually sets them apart from a wizard? Well, where a wizard learns their craft through arduous study and practice, a sorcerer has an innate magical talent. This can be from a variety of things, and where it comes from specifically will make up your subclasses. One of the most common versions of this, if you will, is a draconic bloodline. Somewhere in your past, a dragon has gifted your family with some essence of its very magical nature, which has then manifested down the line as you, someone with an innate connection to magic just the way dragons have it. But while that is certainly a popular way this can happen, it's really just the tip of the iceberg, because a sorcerer can gain this ability simply through a strange twist of fate or a significant event that they went through. So while many might be born with this talent, it is possible for you to come into contact with it later in life, just as an example. So where a wizard uses study and practice, a sorcerer is more about a natural instinct for magic. So naturally, when it comes to role-playing a sorcerer, a lot of it comes down to how did you obtain the power that you have, and what do you plan on doing with it? And because of the nature of how you are gifted or potentially cursed even with this power, can lend itself to some very chosen one style of story. Moving on from the class fantasy though, a little bit of general information about sorcerers is that they are charisma casters. Rather than using knowledge to cast their spells, they coerce and will their magic into existence, or maybe they even persuade the universe to do the things they would like to do, which naturally makes charisma their primary stat. When it comes to proficiencies, however, they get next to nothing. They have no armor proficiency, and they are only proficient in a couple of weapons such as daggers, slings, quarterstaves, or a light crossbow, because as you might imagine, they rely very much so on their magic, or at least in most cases, which we'll swing back around to later. But from there, I want to talk about the subclasses that will be available to us in Baldur's Gate 3, which will then form our Sorceress origin. Now, in early access, we only have access to 2 of these, but on the full launch of the game, you will have access to a third one known as Storm Sorcery. But let's start with the most, I would say, iconic Sorcerer origin, which is the Draconic Bloodline. First, you have to pick which type of dragon you hail from, so to speak, which means you pick the color of dragon that is related to your bloodline. This corresponds with an element. The element of these dragons will be used for a lot of the subsequent class features that you'll pick up from this subclass. For starters, right at level 1, we get Draconic Resilience, which makes your character a little bit tankier, which can be a nice offset for your inherent sort of fragility. But then at 6th level, we'll pick up our Elemental Affinity. Whenever we cast a spell that deals the damage type of our type of ancestry, you get to add your charisma modifier to its damage, essentially making the spells you cast of the same damage type that much more powerful. And you can also use this to potentially gain resistances as well, using sorcery points, which we'll talk about here shortly. Now, there are other Draconic Bloodline features, but those are what you're going to get in Baldur's Gate 3, as we have a level cap of 12 to work with, and the rest of it comes later there. Another, I would say, common Sorceress origin is Wild Magic. Wild magic is quite a bit different. It can actually be considered more of a curse than a blessing in many cases, but essentially, be it either just a sheer fluke or coincidence, or a fey creature playing a prank on you, you have been gifted with wild magic. Magic that is born from chaos naturally. This can be very unpredictable. Every time you cast a spell, there is potential for something else to happen, which are called wild magic surges. Now, the extent of these random effects and exactly what they can wind up doing in Baldur's Gate 3, we don't know the full scope of yet, I would say, but it is very much so a tangible effect that can happen when you cast spells that can either be helpful or potentially detrimental. In either case, though, we still get class features associated with this. For starters, we get Tides of Chaos right out of the gate, which allows us to manipulate the forces of chance, essentially, to give us advantage on attack rolls, ability checks, or saving throws, which basically means we have a better chance of actually succeeding at them, though typically this particular ability interplays a bit with the wild magic surges, which will be interesting to see how that gets implemented overall. At 6th level, though, we pick up Bend Luck, which allows us to spend sorcery points on either helping or hindering a creature on those same parameters, but instead of advantage, they gain a 1d4 bonus or detriment to whatever they happen to roll for them, just allowing you to influence the fate of everyone else. Last but not least for Baldur's Gate 3 subclasses, though, we have the Storm Sorcery. A sorcerer with this subclass gets their innate magical talent, so to speak, usually from the plane of elemental air to some degree. It's also potentially just the result of you being born during a particularly vicious storm that infused you, a child, with natural magic. Or maybe you're descended from a being that deals with elemental air like a djinn. This particular subclass has a lot of potential in Baldur's Gate 3, though, because of a house rule Larian has implemented where targets that are wet actually take double lightning damage. So if you're willing to set some stuff up, you can use Storm Sorcery to devastating effect. Right out of the gate, though, at level 1, they pick up Tempestuous Magic, which allows them to move a certain amount of feet on their turn without provoking attacks of opportunity, allowing them to get out of the way, basically. And then later at 6th level, whenever they use lightning or thunder damaging spells, you can cause a creature nearby within 10 feet of your choosing to take extra damage based on your sorcerer level, with it being like an extra arc of lightning out of your body or something, that kind of thing. So unsurprisingly, if you really want to lean into lightning and thunder damage, Storm Sorcery is the way to go. And again, given Larian's house rule, it can potentially be devastating. Now, that is the subclasses, but let's actually talk about what makes a sorcerer unique otherwise in terms of their spell casting, because beyond a sorcerer's subclass, mechanically speaking, they're actually a very simple class to play. Unlike other casters who typically have to prepare their spells in many cases, such as a wizard or a cleric, sorcerers can just cast what they know. As you level up, you'll gain access to more powerful magic and the slots to cast them with, meaning you'll be able to cast more and more powerful magic as you level up, without ever having to prepare it or worry about whether or not you sorted out your spellbook for the day, so to speak. But this This does come at a small cost. Sorcerers know less spells overall than a wizard does. Now, in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, this really isn't going to come into play very much, but a sorcerer's spell list is a bit smaller than a wizard's. Basically, what they can learn is more limited. But again, where the game's cap is just level 12 here, it's unlikely to cause much of an issue in a game like this. But that leaves us with the most interesting part of being a sorcerer, which is their font of magic feature, or their sorcery points and meta magic. Starting at level 2, you'll pick up sorcery points, and in Baldur's Gate 3, you actually get access to meta magic right away as well, whereas in D&D, normally you get access to the meta magic at level 3. In Baldur's Gate 3, you just get both right at level 2 because it makes sense. Basically though, sorcery points are a resource for sorcerers that they can use to do one of two things primarily. Either convert them into extra spell slots, allowing you to cast more spells without resting, or you can use them to cast meta magic, which are effects that you can add on to spells, with the roleplay of this being that sorcerers are so naturally in tune to what magic truly is that they're able to alter the foundation of it slightly, which allows them to provide extra effects, like being able to cast spells farther, being able to cast them without hurting the people they don't want to hurt, or potentially even casting something twice with the same spell. Meta magic is what really sets apart a sorcerer from everyone else, because they can do some truly devastating spell hits with these, especially if you're just leaning all the way into a blaster caster or a damaging spell casting build. That said though, mechanically that's pretty much all they've got going on. All their eggs are sort of in that one basket. But nonetheless, that unique mechanic does allow them to do some pretty unique things, like alter what is already a very diverse list of spells. And this is in addition to the normal upcasting pretty much every spellcaster can do, where they turn lower level spells into more damaging ones by using higher level spell slots to cast them. Sorcery points, however, are regained on a long rest. So you do have a limited pool of these to work with that increases with your level. Typically you'll have as many sorcery points as you do levels. So because of all this, when it comes to actually playing a sorcerer, they make amazing primary spellcasters. They also make very easy to play spellcasters, because a lot of the more micromanagey things associated with something like a wizard have been taken out of it. You can cast spells without preparing them, you can alter them in fun ways to do devastating things, and really just focus all in on just absolutely obliterating things. And it's because of that that sorcerers are so popular as a spellcasting class. But it can be a little more complex if you want it to, with the addition of multi-classing. I would say there are two very popular ways to multi-class a sorcerer that allow it to do a couple different things. These are mixing it with a Paladin or a Warlock. By mixing a sorcerer with a Paladin, you gain access to a lot of defensive features you wouldn't have otherwise, like armor proficiencies, alongside better weapon proficiencies and extra attack if you take Paladin all the way to level 5. And if you're using a melee with that particular mixing of classes, it will allow you to use these sorcerer's spell slots as fuel for a Paladin's Divine Smite feature, which can have some fun effects with other sorcerer abilities. And then another popular option here is what is called a coffee lock, which is a mix of sorcerer and warlock. The reasons this is so popular in the tabletop version might not be as effective in Baldur's Gate 3. Basically, by mixing these two classes, you get access to the sorcerer's sorcery points, which lets you create spell slots, and then a warlock's pact magic comes with extra special spell slots that can then be used to sort of fuel this, because warlocks can replenish their spell slots on a short rest, and this can sort of feed into an infinite loop of spell slots in the tabletop version. But in Baldur's Gate 3, there is a 2 per day short rest limit, which is going to put a bit of a damper on the ridiculousness of it otherwise, but I imagine even in spite of that, it's likely to still be popular. So there's some ideas when it comes to multi-classing a sorcerer. However, ultimately, a lot of people enjoy playing a sorcerer because it is a very straightforward, simple spellcasting class that can do some devastating amount of damage, with the skill ceiling really being around when and where to use your meta magic to get the biggest effects possible. But ultimately, it's a very straightforward class that can pull off some really big damage without excessive abilities or min-maxing to get you there. That said, that's pretty much going to do it for this video. Like many people, I'm a pretty big fan of a sorcerer, precisely because of its very straightforward approach compared to something like a wizard. But but I'd love to know what you think about the class, which you can let me know down below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time continuing our class overview series for Baldur's Gate 3 with the Wizard, the premier spellcaster of the Forgotten Realms of the D&D worlds, who dedicate their lives to studying and utilizing magic in the various ways it can manifest itself, which ultimately make up their arcane traditions. That said, we're not diving too deep into the math here. We are mostly talking about class mechanics, class fantasy, that kind of thing, and how it relates specifically to Baldur's Gate 3. Though, as a mention, what is currently available in the early access period for Baldur's Gate 3 is 2 of what will ultimately be 8 subclasses, 1 for each school of magic, so to speak. And while we won't be diving into the nitty-gritty details of each one, I will give you a general overview, explaining how a lot of them work in general, because ultimately we don't know if any of these will be changed or manipulated in some way by Larian for launch to make them more interesting, as might be the case, but Wizard subclasses in particular follow a sort of general outline that makes them relatively easy to predict even in a video game. With that out of the way, I like to kick these videos off talking about the class fantasy of a wizard. Now, in many ways, a lot of the classes in D&D have a lot of really interesting nuance to them that, if you want to put in a little bit of effort, can give you something really unique even for someone of that class, such as where they got their powers, what they've done in life, etc. In the case of a wizard, that is certainly still possible. However, at the end of the day, a wizard is someone with an absolute thirst for knowledge, specifically as it relates to the arcane arts, allowing them to cast spells. They dedicate their lives to, in many cases, very literal study of magic. And while that pursuit might take them to dark and dreary dungeons or the stuffy air of a lecture hall, wizards are all unified by that common goal of studying magic. How they choose to do so is where the class fantasy of it comes in. Now, I will say I thought about including a section about the weave and the goddess of magic, Mystra, in this video, but honestly, that's just too much to cover for a video like this that would be way off topic. However, I do want to mention briefly that in the Forgotten Realms, mortals interact with magic via a law of reality, so to speak, called the weave, often referred to as a fabric, and when they are casting their spells, they are ultimately manipulating the weave to produce the effect of magic, with the weave actually communicating with the raw power of magic itself. It acts as a sort of intermediary, and it is the study of the weave and how to manipulate it that wizards pursue with basically everything they have. So when it comes to class fantasy, a lot of it comes down to where did your wizard get their basic training or study, if you will, around how to use magic and interact with it, and then what that continued study looks like. Are they someone who perhaps attended a university for wizards of some kind where they could literally study, or was it a more secretive affair with a wizard learning in secret how to raise corpses and the like, or maybe simply finding dusty old tomes with spells in them ignited some lust for knowledge in you that set you on the wizard's path. However you decide your character got there, that is ultimately what makes a wizard. Now, how wizards choose to use that power can also vary a great deal. Some people, having learned how to essentially manipulate the forces of the universe, use it in search of nothing short of godhood, while still others simply peddle their services as diviners, or maybe some of them put their magic to work in service to royals or under a military environment where they can wreak havoc on a battlefield. So while the pursuit of knowledge is the thread that connects all wizards together, how they choose to pursue that power and how they found it to begin with are largely where things around the class fantasy can come into play, and how you choose to fill those gaps in is largely up to you. Though in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, having a tadpole in your head granting you all sorts of various powers might be exactly the thing your wizard was looking for. From there though, I want to move on and talk about some class mechanics, and first we are going to talk some general information. The primary ability score for a wizard is intelligence. Since what they do is quite literally study magic, an ability ability score that represents their capacity to seek out and devour magic is naturally the way to go. After intelligence, you have a little bit of wiggle room depending on exactly what you want to do, but generally constitution or dexterity, which will help you survive a little longer, are great ways to go. Now when it comes to proficiencies, wizards do not get much. Theirs is a life of study of the arcane, not the martial lessons of the world. They get no armor proficiencies, they've done no training with that at all, and when it comes to weapons, they are only proficient with daggers, darts, slings, quarterstaves, and light crossbows. And even in those cases, there are very few instances where a wizard wouldn't simply be better off casting a cantrip instead of trying to use their actual weapon. And because of this, they are known for a certain degree of frailty, and one of the things about playing a wizard is overcoming that sort of physical frailty, as they are a bit of a glass cannon. Now from there, let's talk about spellcasting. Important to many classes, but none more so than the wizard, wizards will have more spells known and spells available to them than pretty much anyone. And they record all of these in their spell book. This is representative of the spells you know and everything, and in Baldur's Gate 3 there's not a literal book you need to keep up with, but generally this is referred to as a wizard's spell book. And right away, as soon as you make a wizard, you're going to be able to pick some cantrips, which are spells you can cast sort of at will anytime it's your turn, at the cost of an action of some sort, of course, but we'll also pick up 6 first-level spells. And then, every time we level up, we'll get to pick 2 more that we can learn as a representation of our studies and them advancing. These can be any spells from the wizard spell list that you can actually cast, that is to say, you have the appropriate level to do so. However, in order for you to actually cast any of these spells, you have to prepare them. Preparing spells essentially means that they are ready for your wizard to cast. This is a number greatly reduced from what you will actually know. The number of spells you can prepare is a function of your wizard's intelligence modifier plus their wizard level. So while we will know a great many spells, we have to prepare them in order to use them, and even then we are limited by our spell slots. Again, all this is mostly true for all classes, but because this is the wizard's whole deal, I'm explaining it very thoroughly. Now when it comes to spell slots, you're going to gain more of these as you level up, but spell slots are divided up into spell level. Spells will ultimately go from 1 to 9th level, indicating their general power. However, with Baldur's Gate 3's level cap of 12, we will only ever be able to get up to level 6 spells. So while at first level, a wizard will only have 2 first level spell slots, meaning they can only use those spell slots to cast first level spells, by the time they get to 12th level, if you were to go all the way to level 12 with them, they would have 4 first level slots, 3 spell slots for 2nd, 3rd, and 4th level spells respectively, 2 5th level spell slots, and 1 6th level spell slot. Now you can use higher level spell slots to cast lower level spells, which will increase their effect, but of course this means you won't be able to use those higher level spell slots until you rest and recover them. As a result of this, while wizards focus on casting tons and tons of spells, they are somewhat limited in what they can do per day, as they will eventually need to rest. This is where your cantrips come in, and while they won't do as much damage or anything as a bigger actually leveled spell, they do not cost you spell slots, so you can use them in lieu of an actual spell if you were to say run out of spell slots, or if you simply don't want to spend one. Generally, the damage on these cantrips increases as you level up as well to keep them relevant. The last thing here to know really is that it is also possible, again as a reflection of a wizard's study, for them to learn magic elsewhere from outside of just leveling up. You can usually do this by learning them from scrolls being the most common way, though this will typically cost you a small amount of gold to transcribe the spell into your wizard spell book, but this will then turn that spell into a spell known. It does of course need to be a wizard spell, and between their naturally higher known amount of spells and their ability to scribe scrolls, wizards can learn an intense amount of spells, and because of that and their need to prepare spells ahead of time, a lot of playing a wizard comes down to knowing what to prepare when, because in a video game, this essentially translates to either swapping spells out when you level or going to the prepared spells pane, where you can swap out what you have prepared and when, though you'll need to rest for these to take effect. So to get the most out of spell casting, it helps to have a general idea of what you'll be up against and what you think will be most useful, so you know what your wizard needs to prepare for ahead of time, even though there are of course some general spells that are useful in basically every situation. From there though, let's move on to other class mechanics. Outside of our subclass, there's really only one, and that is Arcane Recovery. This is an ability that will let you recover some of your spell slots in between short rests, with a long rest, of course, just resetting them all together. So with Arcane Recovery, you have a little bit of an extension to the amount of spells you can cast per day, though Arcane Recovery is a bit limited in how much it can recover for you, so don't expect to fully recover your spells this way. From there, though, we are brought to subclasses. There are a couple more class mechanics for a wizard, but they don't come up until much later into their level progression, which is past what Baldur's Gate 3's level cap is, so there's not much point in talking about them. However, when it comes to subclasses is where things with a wizard get really interesting, because ultimately this is showing off the specialization of our wizard. They will pick an arcane tradition, which allows them to specialize in a school of magic and get extra effects when casting those spells. However, because there's so many of them, all of them follow a general template. Again, there's going to be 8 of these in the launch version of the game. However, in the case of every single one of them, you can expect the following. Right away at level 2, when you pick your subclass, you'll get half off the gold cost of scribing scrolls for that school of spell. This just makes it easier to learn spells in your specialization. And then from there, at 2nd, 6th, and 10th level for Baldur's Gate 3, you can expect a class feature of some sort, or an ability beyond just casting spells that typically augments them in some way. And these features are really what are going to set individual wizards apart. So we'll talk about a few of them just so you can get a general idea of what they do. But again, the vast majority of these are not in early access, so what they wind up doing with each might change a little bit. However, we can show off Evocation and Abjuration, which are 2 of the more popular ones to be sure, because Evocation is your standard damaging spellcasts. Your fireballs, your lightning spells, that kind of thing. Most of those fall under Evocation. So right at 2nd level, Evocation wizards get the ability to sculpt their spells. This allows them to use AoE spells where your allies are standing without actually hurting them. And then their 6th and 10th level features actually empower their spells, with the 6th level one giving them better cantrips and the 10th level one allowing them to add their intelligence modifier to the damage rolls of their spells. But something like Abjuration is quite a bit different. Right at 2nd level, whenever you cast an Abjuration spell, you can create a sort of damage shield on yourself. And then at 6th level, anybody within 30 feet of them, when they get hit, you can choose to have that damage redirected to your ward, with their 10th level feature letting them add their proficiency bonus to things like Counterspell, which means Abjuration has a slightly more defensive focus on its magic. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg for these subclasses, because things like Necromancy is going to, at level 6, give you extra benefits to your Animate Dead spell to, of course, symbolize what you know about necromancy. However, many of these have slightly more vague descriptions that go beyond what might be something you could implement in a video game, which is why I suspect they will make some changes, such as the School of Transmutation's 2nd level ability, allowing you to alter the physical properties of an item in some way. But this is only temporary, so exactly what they do with that in the game has yet to be seen. With that said, I think you get the gist of what wizards are all about and how they perform and specialize in spellcasting. While a sorcerer might get things like metamagic and rely on fewer spells known, a wizard is really about exemplifying the knowledge they've gained and learned over the years. So when it comes to playing a wizard, there's a few things to know. Now, obviously this class is best suited for some type of support or damage-oriented spellcasting, as that is pretty much everything their class entails. You're either going to be supporting your party through various spells, or just trying to deal as much damage as possible, which is certainly what wizards are good at. However, that does have to be counterbalanced against their general frailty. Any way that you can supplement what a wizard can do for you in terms of their life expectancy is certainly very helpful, and in many cases even this can come down to spells to help mitigate damage. However, another big aspect of that is actually just knowing when and what to prepare. Now, ultimately there are just way too many spells in D&D, and certainly in Baldur's Gate 3, for me to go over them all in detail here and give you a rundown, but basically when it comes to playing a wizard, a lot of it comes down to managing your spells and knowing what you're about to be going up against. Because it is a class where knowledge is very much so power, and thanks to their very large number of spells known, they can prepare for just about any situation, but they do have to do that preparation. Now, when it comes to multi-classing a wizard, there are a few options, but it is a class where multi-classing is kind of all over the place. Generally, though, a very common approach here is to simply try to give a wizard more survivability, such as multi-classing them with a fighter for things like heavy armor, and then action surge, which for a wizard is very, very good. There are other forms of this as well, such as Paladin, which also gets heavy armor. You can multi-class them with a Cleric, which can also have a variety of useful abilities depending on their domain. And while things like that tend to be really helpful with a wizard who's already going to do fantastic damage with their spells, you can still multi-class them with other casters to get interesting effects, such as a Sorcerer to get access to the Sorcerer's metamagic and the wizard's bigger amount of spells known, which can be a win-win. However, the catch there is that they don't use the same casting stat, with Sorcerers using Charisma, so that can be a little bit hard to balance, though certainly not impossible. And honestly, with Baldur's Gate 3's removal of the attribute requirement for multi-classing already confirmed, this might be easier than it initially appears, though you do have to weigh any multi-classing with a wizard against what they are losing in terms of their spells. So it can be a bit tricky to balance with this one. With that in mind though, whether you are casting Fireball in every situation as is tradition, or you are raising corpses after many unsavory experiments in a dark laboratory, or perhaps you're simply casting illusions for a simple laugh here and there, wizards are masters of magic, capable of wielding immense power that can be devastating to both enemies and potentially friends alike. So with all of that said, that has been our class overview for the Wizard in Baldur's Gate 3. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my Warlock class overview ahead of the launch of Baldur's Gate 3, kicking off a series of sorts where we will be going over the classes, talking about them in depth, and specifically how some stuff has been done in Baldur's Gate 3, though realistically this would probably provide a pretty good overview for 5th edition D&D as well if you wanted, as that is what the game is based on. That said though, we're not going to be diving deep into the math of various things, as that type of content is better suited for a build video. Here we're talking about things like class fantasy, subclass features, as well as just general mechanics that inform how the class plays. So to kick this off, I want to talk about the class fantasy of a warlock, what they are meant to be, and what defines them. What defines a warlock is a pact with a powerful being, though specifically not a god, as gods would typically be served by clerics, or potentially a paladin. A warlock, however, is serving beings that would not typically be served by things like a cleric or a paladin. Things to think of in this way would be archfey, great old ones, or fiends, which just so happen to be the subclasses for Baldur's Gate 3, but there are others as well. The most common by far, though, is the fiend, or a devil usually. And these particular pacts often have to do with turning a person evil or leading them astray so their soul winds up in hell. But if your pact is with something like a great old one, the reasons the pact exists or what the great old one is even getting out of it can be much more obscure. So what defines a warlock is the pact they made with this being that's giving them the power. And while that will translate into all sorts of mechanical stuff we'll get into, from a roleplay standpoint, it's important to differentiate a few things. For starters, a warlock is not worshipping anything. This is a contractual agreement of some sort. The exact terms, especially in the tabletop version, are largely up to the player or the DM, but in a video game it's much more obscure than that. You can kind of headcanon whatever that pact is with yourself. But the long and short of it is, as long as you uphold your end of the bargain, you will keep receiving power from your patron, which mechanically would be like leveling up. Now, while people like to play D&D in a variety of ways and can do whatever at their own table, an important distinction about a warlock is that, at least according to Wizards of the Coast, once they've obtained power from their patron, it's not typically something that can be taken away. It's things that are more like knowledge knowledge gained or being taught how to do something. Now you just kind of know. But again, the specifics are down to you, but in a video game it's much more obscure than that. But as for your character's relationship with that patron, it can be many things. It can be antagonistic, it can be mutually beneficial, it can be quite literally a contractual agreement. But the key thing to remember is that a warlock's power comes from this pact and they are receiving it from their patron in the form of knowledge gained. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the ways that power manifests itself into whatever it is that warlock happens to be doing. Now, a little bit of general info in terms of game mechanics. The primary attribute for a warlock is charisma, and they typically wear light armor and simple weapons. And while it's very easy to turn them into a caster of sorts, and many people like to multi-class with this class to make use of their very unique spell slots, which we'll get into, it's also possible to make them into a more martially focused character, which will be the case in Baldur's Gate 3 as well. But given that you typically start with light weapons and light armor, you might want to consider getting proficiencies from things like backgrounds, etc., to get you access to heavier armor or potentially martial weapons, which would include things like a two-hander or just anything beyond very basic, simple stuff. Provided, of course, you want to go melee and not simply a caster. Now, as I've already mentioned, the patrons available to a warlock in Baldur's Gate 3 will be the Fiend, the Great Old One, or the Archfey. These are effectively your subclasses and define many of the features you'll be getting over the course of the game and as you level up. Each of these subclasses will give you access to different features, such as the Archfey giving you the ability to charm things, Great Old Ones giving you access to more psychic powers and abilities, things that affect the mind, and then the Fiend will usually just give you straight up damage, or in some cases resistances. For instance, right out of the gate, the Fiend gets an ability that will allow them to gain extra hit points if they kill something. In addition to this, these patrons can also give you extra spells as you level up. That is to say, you will be able to learn different spells according to the patron you have. Though of these three, I do want to mention that the Archfey is by far and away the least popular, typically because its abilities center around things like scaring your enemies, causing them to be frightened, the ability to charm them or put them to sleep, things like that. And most people just prefer the straight up damage the other two will get you. But in a role-playing game like Baldur's Gate 3, I think the Archfey might actually have more uses than it might initially appear. So if you wanted to make use of the Warlock's high charisma and try to avoid fighting every once in a while with some utility to back that up, the Archfey might be more your speed. Regardless of which patron you pick though, all of them are going to give you access to the Warlock's special version of spellcasting known as Pact Magic. Unlike other casters, a Warlock will never have very many spells available to cast to them all at once. However, they are able to recharge these spell slots on a short rest. In Baldur's Gate 3, you click a button to short rest and it refreshes your spell slots, so it's very easy. But there is a limit to that. You can only do it twice per day. So you will ultimately get more than just these very few spells available to you, but in a single round of combat, you're only going to be able to use these spell slots a couple of times because that's all you have. However, these spell slots are always cast at a base level, regardless of the spell you use. So once you hit level 3 with a Warlock, their spell levels becomes 2, which means every spell that I cast will be upcast to level 2, even if it's a level 1 spell. And then by the time you are 9th level, this maxes out at 5th level, meaning that every spell I cast will be cast as a 5th level spell. This acts as a sort of counterweight against our relatively limited amount of spell slots. However, while that might seem very limiting, even with the short rest option, it is worth mentioning that there are a lot of ways for a Warlock to get casts of a spell that don't actually cost them a spell slot, such as our invocations, our pact boons, or potentially a mystic arcanum. To address those individually, invocations are magical abilities that will either buff something you can already do, or give you an extra feature, such as, again, being able to cast something without expending a spell slot, or being able to resist something. Some invocations are hidden behind prerequisites, that is to say, some of them require you to take on a specific pact boon, which we're about to talk about. In fact, these invocations are what turn the Eldritch Blast cantrip a Warlock will have into, frankly, the best cantrip in the game, as one of them allows you to add your charisma modifier to the damage, which means your basic cantrip spell that won't take up spell slots becomes pretty damaging in most instances, and can be augmented further with other invocations that will do things like push an enemy back, for instance. With the max level in Baldur's Gate being 12, you'll potentially be able to learn up to 6 Eldritch invocations, potions, which can provide some serious buffs to whatever it is you happen to be doing. But then we have our Pact Boon. Once we reach level 3 as a Warlock, you receive a gift, so to speak, from your patron. Now in early access, we only had access to Pact of the Chain, which will grant you the service of a familiar. But in the full version of Baldur's Gate 3, we will have 3 choices here, at least at a minimum, with the other 2 being Pact of the Blade and Pact of the Tome. I don't want to get into too much of what these do specifically because we already know they're house ruling at least what Pact of the Blade is doing. So to put it a little more simply, Pact of the Blade will allow you to make a pact with a weapon, which will, as you might imagine, make you more effective with using that weapon. Whereas Pact of the Tome grants you access to a small magical tome called the Book of Shadows, which normally allows you to cast more cantrips, which are level 0 spells, so to speak, that you can cast without using spell slots, and we'll see if they happen to do anything else there. But those are generally the type of things you can expect at level 3 when you get to take on your Pact Boon. Now the last thing I want to mention for the Warlock, as far as mechanics go, is the Mystic Arcanum. If you happen to bring your Warlock all the way up to level 11 and don't multi-class it into something, you'll gain access to Mystic Arcanum. This allows you to cast a 6th level spell from the Warlock spell list without expending a spell slot. However, you actually have to long rest before you can do this again. So essentially, this is simply a free spell cast with a higher level spell than you would normally get to cast as a Warlock. Normally, you would get a few of these as you leveled up, but because the level cap in Baldur's Gate 3 is 12, you will literally only potentially get one of these. Now, as far as playing a Warlock goes, they can be pretty versatile. They can be competent in melee while at the same time getting access to a decent amount of spell casting. So in many ways, they can perform a sort of Gish role, that is to say a mix of melee and magic, that can be pretty fun to mess around with because of all the features and differences between them. Though I will say, a lot of people don't tend to play pure Warlock because oftentimes even the class fantasy doesn't always make a ton of sense for that. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, a Warlock is defined by their pact. Once that pact is complete, depending on its nature, you could roleplay, so to speak, that you kind of just moved on to something else with your knowledge gained. And outside of it just being very easy to roleplay a Warlock into other classes with the completion of their pact, or vice versa, the taking on of a pact at a certain level in another class, just so happens to make this a very handy reason to justify multi-classing them, because Warlocks are a very popular multi-class choice because of the way some of their features work, specifically their spell slots. When interacting with another casting class, Warlock spells can be cast with the other caster's spell slots, or the other caster can use the Warlock spell slots, which can then be recharged on a short rest, which can be very handy for a spellcaster, at the expense of higher level spells known, which because of the low level limit, we don't know how that'll play out in Baldur's Gate 3. But oftentimes you'll see people use levels in Warlock specifically because of the unique features they're granted, like the Pact Magic and the Pact Boons. But as for me, I really enjoy Warlocks because it allows you to play a Gish character that doesn't just feel like two other classes kind of slammed together, which tends to be the case, while at the same time even providing a compelling case for role-playing around the way their pact actually works. So whether it be slinging eldritch blasts at people, swinging swords in melee, or reacting with hellish rebukes, Warlocks can do a little bit of everything. And their unique mechanics and role-playing is why they are my favorite 5th edition D&D class. So I hope you learned a little bit about them in this video, talking about what to expect from the class, some of their mechanics, how they play. But by all means, let me know what you think about it down in the comments section below. If you have any suggestions or things you'd like to add, by all means, throw them down there. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.